I was documenting abandoned settlements in northern British Columbia for a historical preservation project, and I found a ghost town called Kitsault that was abandoned in 1982, but looks like everyone just walked away yesterday. And I'm starting to think some of the residents never actually left. I work as a freelance researcher and photographer, specializing in documenting abandoned communities across Canada before they're completely lost to time and weather. The project that brought me to Kitsault was funded by a provincial heritage organization interested in preserving the history of BC's resource towns communities that boomed and died with the industries that created them. Kitsault is one of the strangest examples of this phenomenon. The town was built in 1979 by Phelps Dodge Corporation to house workers for a molybdenum mine, a planned community constructed from scratch in one of the most remote parts of northern BC, accessible only by logging roads or by boat. The company invested millions building a complete town over 100 houses, apartment buildings, a shopping mall, hospital, recreation center, library, everything a community of 1,200 people would need. The mine operated for less than 2 years. When molybdenum prices collapsed in 1982, Phelps Dodge shut down operations and everyone left within weeks. The company mothballed the entire town, maintaining it with a skeleton crew, apparently hoping the mine would eventually reopen. It never did. What makes Kitsault unique is how well preserved it is. Most ghost towns deteriorate rapidly once abandoned vandalism, weather, scavengers, stripping anything valuable. But Kitsault has been locked behind a gate and maintained for over 40 years. The current owner keeps the buildings in good repair, the grass mowed, the streets clear. Walking into Kitsault is like stepping into 1982 and finding everyone gone but everything else exactly as they left it. I first visited in the spring of last year, having secured permission from the property management company to access the site for documentation purposes. The drive took me deep into the coastal mountains north of Terrace, hours on logging roads through old-growth forest, until I reached the locked gate with its security camera and intercom. I'd been given a access code, and the gate swung open automatically, revealing a paved road leading into the valley where Kitsault sits. The town appeared gradually, as I drove first the outlying houses, then the apartment buildings, then the shopping mall and community center, all arranged in neat residential patterns, all perfectly maintained but completely empty. I parked in front of the mall and started exploring on foot, my camera documenting everything. The preservation was incredible. Houses still had furniture in them, beds made with 1980s, patterned sheets, kitchens with dishes in the cabinets, living rooms with couches and televisions. The shopping mall was the most surreal stores with products still on the shelves, a grocery store with canned goods from 40 years ago, a clothing store with fashions from 1982 still on the racks. Everything was dusty but intact, frozen in time, waiting for customers who would never come. I spent 3 days on that first visit, photographing buildings, documenting the layout, taking notes on the preservation. I stayed in one of the houses that had been designated for researcher use, sleeping in a bedroom that looked exactly as it had when its original occupants left 4 decades ago. At night, the town was profoundly silent, no traffic sounds, no people, no animals, just the wind moving through empty streets. I returned 2 months later for my second visit, planning to photograph the interiors more extensively. Everything appeared the same as I'd left it, same buildings, same streets, same eerie preservation. I documented the mall again, the community center, several of the houses. Nothing seemed different, but on my third visit, 3 months after the second, I started noticing discrepancies. Small things at first, details that made me question my memory. I'd photographed a particular kitchen on my first visit, and I was certain the dishes in the glass front cabinets had been arranged with plates on the left, cups on the right. Now they were reversed. I checked my photos from the first visit. Yes, definitely different. The plates were now where the cups had been. I moved through the house more carefully, comparing what I saw to my previous documentation. Furniture had been rearranged in the living room. The couch was against a different wall. The coffee table had been moved. Books on the shelves were in different positions. Someone had been in this house since my last visit, living in it, using it, rearranging things. I went to other houses I documented. Same pattern. Furniture moved, items repositioned, signs that someone had been there, had been living in these spaces, maintaining them, going about domestic routines in a town that was supposed to be locked and inaccessible. I checked with the property management company when I got back to civilization. They insisted no one had been given access to Kitsault between my visits. The maintenance crew only came quarterly, and their last visit had been before my second trip. No researchers, no film crews, no one should have been there. On my fourth visit, I came specifically to investigate. I set up cameras in several houses, motion activated, hidden in places where they wouldn't be obvious. I documented the exact position of items in each room, photographing from multiple angles, creating a baseline I could compare to on my next trip. I returned a month later. The cameras had been triggered. Hundreds of photos, taken at various times over the 4 weeks, showing movement through the houses. But the images were strange, blurred figures, faces that didn't quite resolve, people who looked almost normal but with something wrong about their proportions or the way they moved, and the timestamps were wrong. The cameras were set to BC time, but the timestamps suggested the photos were being taken in a different time zone or a different time entirely. And the items I documented had moved again, more dramatically this time. Entire rooms rearranged, kitchen cabinets reorganized, closets with different clothes than had been there before 1980 styles, but not the same specific items. In one house, in the master bedroom, I found something that made my hands shake. On the nightstand was a grocery receipt, dated from 2 weeks ago, from a store in Terrace. Fresh groceries, purchased recently, brought to this abandoned town and stored in a refrigerator that had no power, but that was somehow keeping them cold and fresh. I opened the refrigerator carefully. Milk, eggs, cheese, vegetables, all fresh, showing no signs of spoilage, despite the fridge having no electricity. The food was being kept cold by something other than refrigeration, preserved by whatever force was keeping Kitsault frozen in 1982. I went through the house systematically, documenting everything. In the bathroom, toiletries that hadn't been there before. In the bedroom closet, clothes arranged as if someone was selecting outfits daily. In the living room, a television that I knew didn't work, that couldn't work without power, but that had a warm screen as if it had been on recently. Then I went to the community center, the large building that had served as Kitsault's social hub. Inside, I found the library area with its shelves of books from the early 1980s. And on one of the reading tables, I found a journal. The journal was new, modern, purchased recently based on the style, but the handwriting inside was old-fashioned, careful and precise like people wrote in the early 1980s before computers became common. The entries were dated, the most recent from 3 days ago. I read through them, my unease growing with each page. The writer identified themselves as Margaret Chen, one of Kitsault's original residents. The entries described daily life in the town, going to the store, attending community events, socializing with neighbors, all written in present tense, as if this was happening now, as if Kitsault was still a functioning community. But the dates were current. The entries spanned the past 6 months, describing a version of Kitsault that was occupied, active, ongoing. Margaret wrote about her job at the mine, about her friends and neighbors, about the rhythms of life in this remote company town. She wrote about the weather, about town meetings, about ordinary domestic details. And she wrote about seeing the photographer, clearly meaning me, appearing in town periodically, walking through houses, taking pictures, not interacting with anyone. She described me as if I was a ghost to her, a fleeting presence that appeared and disappeared, someone from another world briefly visible in hers. The most recent entry, from 3 days before I found the journal, described seeing me setting up cameras, watching me document the houses, wondering why I couldn't see her or the others, why I treated Kitsault as if it was abandoned when to her it was full of people living their normal lives. I sat in the community center for a long time, trying to process what I was reading. The journal suggested that Kitsault wasn't abandoned at all, that it was still occupied by its original residents, still functioning as it had in 1982, existing in some parallel version of time where the mine never closed and the town never emptied. And somehow, the two versions overlapped. The abandoned Kitsault I was documenting, and the occupied Kitsault that Margaret Chen was living in. The same physical space, existing in two different states simultaneously, with occasional bleed-through between them, items moving, food appearing, journal entries left behind. I took the journal with me when I left, along with all my camera equipment and documentation. I've analyzed the photos from the motion-activated cameras, studied the blurred figures, tried to enhance the images to see the faces more clearly. But the more I process the images, the more they degrade, as if the camera was capturing something that doesn't quite exist in our version of reality. I've researched Margaret Chen. There was a woman by that name who lived in Kitsault in 1981 to 1982, worked in the mine's administrative offices, left when the town closed. I found her obituary. She died in 1,995 inches Vancouver, 13 years after leaving Kitsault. But the journal entries are recent, written in the past 6 months, in handwriting that matches samples I've found from the historical Margaret Chen. I think what happened is that when Kitsault was abandoned, when everyone left, some version of the town refused to accept the closure. Some echo or impression of the community continued, sustained by the preservation efforts, kept alive by the fact that the physical town was never demolished or left to decay. And the people who lived there, or versions of them, memories of them, something continued their lives in a Kitsault that never closed, that exists alongside the abandoned version, but in a different temporal space. I've been back to Kitsault once since finding the journal. My 5th visit, 2 weeks ago. I went specifically to try to make contact, to see if I could interact with whatever or whoever is living there. I walked through the town calling out, announcing my presence, trying to reach across the barrier between the two versions. I saw someone, just once, for maybe 3 seconds. A woman in early 1980s clothing, standing in the doorway of one of the houses, looking directly at me. I recognized her from historical photos. Margaret Chen, looking exactly as she had in pictures from 1982, not aged at all despite the 40 years that have passed. She raised her hand in a wave, a greeting, an acknowledgement. And then she was gone, the doorway empty, the house as abandoned as all the others. I found another journal entry, left in the same place at the community center. A new page, dated from the day of my visit, written while I was there. Margaret described seeing me more clearly this time, described me calling out, trying to communicate. She wrote that she could almost hear me, that the barrier between the two Kitsaults seemed thinner than usual, that maybe someday we'd be able to truly interact, to understand the space we both occupy. She wrote that she doesn't know why she and the others are still in Kitsault, why they didn't leave when everyone else did, why they continue their lives in a town that they're increasingly aware might not exist in the same way it did. She wrote about seeing the decay starting to creep into their version of the town, how buildings that were pristine in their Kitsault sometimes show the aging and deterioration from our version, how the boundary between occupied and abandoned is becoming more permeable. And she wrote that they're not alone, that there are other preserved towns across BC, across Canada, across the world, places that were left behind but never truly abandoned, communities that continue in parallel versions sustained by memory and preservation, ghost towns that are only ghosts to us but that remain vibrantly alive to their eternal residents. I don't know if I'll go back to Kitsault again. The project I was hired for is complete. I've documented the physical town extensively, gathered enough material for any historical preservation purpose. But I think about it constantly. I think about Margaret Chen and the others, living their 1,982 lives in a town that officially emptied 40 years ago, going to work at a mine that closed, shopping at stores that have no products, existing in a space that occupies the same physical location as the abandoned town I photographed, but that exists in a different version of time. And I think about the journal, about the entries that keep appearing, about how Margaret writes about seeing the abandoned version starting to bleed into hers, about how the two Kitsaults are becoming more aware of each other, about how the barrier between them might eventually dissolve entirely. I keep the journal in my office, and sometimes new entries appear in it, even though the journal never leaves my desk. Margaret writes to me now, describes her life in the town that never left, asks questions about the world outside that she can't access, wonders if she and the others are alive or dead or something else entirely. The most recent entry appeared this morning. Margaret wrote that fewer people are visible in her version of Kitsault now, that neighbors she sees daily are starting to fade, that the town feels less populated than it used to. She wrote that she thinks the preserved Kitsault is slowly winding down, that whatever force sustained it for 40 years is weakening, that eventually her version will fade completely and only the abandoned town will remain. She wrote that she's not afraid of disappearing, that she's lived the same pleasant years in Kitsault over and over, that if this is how her existence ends, she has no regrets. But she wanted me to know, Wanted someone from the other version to understand that Kitsault never truly emptied, that the town that everyone thought was abandoned was actually still full of life, just life that existed in a space parallel to our own. The town that never left is still there, in northern BC, locked behind its gate, perfectly preserved, waiting. And in that same space, occupying the same buildings and streets, another version of Kitsault continues, growing fainter, populated by echoes of residents who left 40 years ago, but who never truly departed, who remain in the town that was too well preserved to ever truly die. I don't know how long both versions will coexist, but I know that when you preserve something perfectly, when you maintain it as if the people who live there might return, sometimes they do, or something like them does, sustained by the physical preservation, kept alive by the refusal to let the community die, existing in a ghost town that's only a ghost to those of us who can't see across the temporal boundary into the version that never emptied. There's an abandoned mining town called Sandon in the Kootenay region that was destroyed by floods and avalanches in the 1950s, and I hiked there in July and found snow that's been falling continuously for 70 years, and I think the snow is trying to bury something that should have stayed buried. I'm a backcountry photographer, spending my summers documenting British Columbia's ghost towns, those remnants of the mining era that dot the province's mountain valleys. Most of them are just collections of collapsed buildings and rusted equipment, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But they all have stories worth preserving before they disappear completely. Sandon has always fascinated me more than the others. It had one of the most dramatic histories of any BC mining town, founded in the 1890s during the silver boom. It grew to over 5,000 people at its peak, with hotels, banks, opera houses, all the trappings of a prosperous frontier city. But the boom didn't last. By the 1920s, the silver was running out, and people started leaving. Then in 1955, Carpenter Creek flooded catastrophically, destroying most of what remained. The few buildings that survived the flood were buried by avalanches over the following winters. By the 1960s, Sandon was essentially abandoned, left to the forest and the snow. I'd been planning to photograph Sandon for 2 years, waiting for the right weather conditions and getting the necessary permits to access the site. In mid-July, I finally made the trip, hiking in from New Denver with my camera equipment and camping gear. It's about a 12-kilometer hike through dense forest, following old mining roads that are barely maintained, ending at the town site nestled in a narrow valley between steep mountain slopes. I reached the valley around noon on a clear, warm day. The temperature was probably 25 degrees Celsius, typical summer weather for the Kootenays. But as I descended into the valley where Sandon sits, I felt the temperature drop noticeably. And then I saw the snow. It was falling steadily, thick flakes coming down in a way that suggested this wasn't just starting. It looked like snow that had been falling for hours, maybe days. I stopped on the trail and just stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was the middle of July. The surrounding mountains showed no snow, except on the highest peaks. The trail I'd been hiking had been clear and dry, but here in this specific valley, it was snowing heavily. I checked my weather app, thinking maybe there was some localized system I hadn't known about, but the forecast showed clear skies and warm temperatures for the entire region. No precipitation expected. I looked at the temperature reading on my phone, still showing 22 degrees, which should have been far too warm for snow, let alone for snow to accumulate. But it was accumulating. The ground was covered in several inches of snow, fresh and white, unmarked except for the tracks of small animals. And it was cold. I could see my breath, could feel the chill through my hiking clothes, despite my phone insisting the temperature was above 20 degrees. I continued down to the town site, my boots crunching through snow that shouldn't exist. Sandon appeared through the falling snow like something from an old photograph, a handful of wooden buildings in various states of collapse, old mining equipment half buried in drifts, the ruins of what had been a thriving town now reduced to a few structures fighting a losing battle against time and weather. I set up my camera equipment in the shelter of one of the more intact buildings and started documenting what I was seeing. The snow fell continuously, steadily, with no variation in intensity. It wasn't a storm. There was no wind, no thunder, just snow falling straight down in an endless curtain of white. And the strangest thing was how quiet it was. Snow usually deadens sound, but this was beyond normal, snow quiet. This was absolute silence, as if the snow was absorbing not just sound but something more fundamental, creating a void where noise should be. I spent that first afternoon photographing the town, documenting the buildings and equipment, all of it covered in accumulating snow. I took temperature readings every hour. The air temperature stayed consistently around -2 degrees Celsius, according to my thermometer, despite my phone still claiming it was 20+ degrees. The snow showed no sign of melting, even where sunlight broke through the cloud cover and should have warmed exposed surfaces. That night, I camped in one of the old buildings, a structure that still had most of its roof intact. The snow continued falling through the night, and I could hear it accumulating on the roof, a soft, constant susurration that never varied. I kept expecting the snowfall to stop, for this bizarre weather anomaly to pass, but it just continued, steady and relentless. The next morning, I hiked down to New Denver, a small town about 10 kilometers away, to ask locals about the snow. I found a cafe and struck up conversations with people who'd lived in the area for decades. When I mentioned the snow in Sandon, they just nodded, unsurprised. "It's been snowing there since the 50s, an old man told me. Year-round, every day, doesn't matter what the weather's like everywhere else. Just Sandon, just that valley." I asked if anyone knew why, if there was some meteorological explanation, some unusual microclimate that could cause perpetual snowfall in such a localized area. He shrugged. "Theories, sure. Cold air trapped in the valley, moisture from the creek, mountain effects. But none of it really explains it. The snow just falls there. Has for 70 years. We've gotten used to it." I asked if anyone ever went up there, if researchers had studied the phenomenon. He shook his head. "Used to be some interest, back in the 60s and 70s. Scientists came, took measurements, couldn't explain it, gave up. Now it's just accepted. Sand and snows. That's what it does." I went back to the town site that afternoon, determined to document this properly, to understand what I was seeing. I set up my equipment again and started a systematic study of the snowfall, timing the rate of accumulation, measuring the depth of existing drifts, trying to find any pattern or variation. The snow fell at a consistent rate about 2 centimeters per hour, but the accumulation didn't match what that rate should produce. By my calculations, if snow had been falling at this rate for 70 years, the entire valley should be buried under hundreds of meters of snow. But the depth varied. Some areas had drifts of 3 or 4 meters, others had just a few inches, and the variation didn't correspond to wind patterns or shelter from the snowfall. On my second day, I started exploring the deeper drifts, using a probe to measure their depth and see what was buried beneath them. In one drift behind what had been the town's general store, I found something that made my skin crawl. About 2 meters down, my probe struck something solid. I spent an hour carefully digging, brushing away snow with my hands, and uncovered mining equipment, a wheelbarrow, some tools, a lunch pail. The equipment looked recently used. The wheelbarrow's metal showed no rust. The tools were clean and functional. The lunch pail was intact, and when I opened it against my better judgment, I found a sandwich and an apple that looked fresh, as if someone had packed it that morning. But this equipment had been buried under snow that had accumulated over decades. This lunch had been packed in the 1950s or earlier, and it should have been long since decayed. But the snow had preserved it perfectly, keeping it in the exact state it had been in when it was buried. I found more items as I explored other drifts. A child's toy, bright and unfaded. A newspaper from 1954, still crisp and readable. Personal belongings, a wallet with identification. Photographs that showed color as vibrant as the day they were taken. All of it buried under years of accumulated snow, all of it perfectly preserved, frozen in time. I started to understand what was happening here. The snow wasn't just falling, it was preserving. Everything it covered stopped aging, stopped deteriorating, was held in suspended time for as long as the snow covered it. Sandon wasn't just being buried by this perpetual snowfall. It was being preserved, frozen in the moment of its abandonment. On my third day, I ventured deeper into the heaviest drifts, following them up toward the mountainside where the worst of the avalanches had struck in the late 1950s. The snow here was deeper, older, layered in a way that suggested decades of accumulation. And in these ancient drifts, I found buildings' entire structures buried so completely that you wouldn't know they existed unless you were specifically looking for them. I carefully excavated the entrance to one building, a process that took hours, tunneling through compressed snow that had the consistency of ice. When I finally broke through into the interior, I found a perfectly preserved house from the 1950s. The furniture was arranged as if someone had just stepped out. There were dishes on the table with food still on them. A newspaper lay on a chair, dated March 1955, and everything was pristine, untouched by decay, as fresh as the day it had been covered by the snow. I photographed everything, documenting this impossible preservation. And as I worked, I started to notice something disturbing. The accumulation of items, the arrangement of furniture, the evidence of daily life, it all suggested that people had been living in Sandon right up until the moment it was buried. The official history said the town had been mostly abandoned by the 1950s, with just a handful of holdouts. But this house, and the others I found buried in the deeper drifts, all showed signs of recent occupation when they were covered. I found more houses as I explored, each one telling the same story, people living normal lives, going about their daily routines, and then suddenly being buried by snow. I found breakfast tables with food still warm according to my infrared thermometer, beds that looked recently slept in, stoves with fires that had stopped burning only because the snow had smothered them. And I started to wonder, where were the people? If they'd been living here when the snow came, if everything else had been so perfectly preserved, where were the bodies? I searched every house I uncovered, looking for any sign of human remains, and found nothing. The houses were occupied right up until the moment of burial, but the occupants had vanished. On my fourth day, I found the answer in a house near the center of the old town site. I'd excavated my way into what had been a family home. I could tell from the children's toys, the family photographs on the walls, and in the living room, I found them. A family of 4, sitting in chairs arranged around a radio, listening to something, their faces calm and expectant, but they weren't bodies. They were snow. Perfect snow sculptures in the exact shape of human beings, detailed down to the individual fingers, the texture of clothing, the expressions on their faces. I stood there staring at them for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. The snow had preserved everything in this town: objects, buildings, food, and it had preserved the people too, but not as bodies. It had transformed them, converted them into snow itself, making them part of the eternal winter that had claimed this valley. I reached out to touch one of the figures, a woman, sitting with her hands folded in her lap, her face serene. The moment my fingers made contact, the figure collapsed into powder, dissipating into the air like any snowfall would. I stepped back, horrified, watching the snow that had been a person scatter and settle onto the floor. I left that house immediately and started checking the others I'd uncovered. In every occupied building, I found the same thing: snow sculptures of people, frozen in whatever they'd been doing when the snow came, preserved in ice and powder for 70 years until someone like me came along and disturbed them. I packed up my equipment that night, planning to hike out the next morning. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the endless snow falling on the roof, I started to feel drowsy in a way that didn't match my level of exhaustion. It was a heavy, pulling drowsiness, like I was being sedated, and I realized with growing horror that this was how it must have felt for the people of Sandon. The snow didn't bury them violently. It lulled them, made them sleepy, made them want to sit down and rest while the snow fell around them. And then it transformed them, slowly, peacefully, into sculptures of ice that would last as long as the snow kept falling. I forced myself to stay awake, packing my gear in the dark, hiking out of the valley by the light of my headlamp. The snow fell on me as I climbed out of the valley, and I could feel its pull, that seductive drowsiness that wanted me to stop, to rest, to let the snow do its work. But I kept moving, pushing through the exhaustion, and finally emerged into the normal summer night beyond the valley's influence. I hiked all the way back to New Denver without stopping, and when I reached the town around dawn, I was covered in snow that melted off me in the warm morning sun, leaving no trace it had ever been there. I've tried to report what I found to various authorities, the provincial government, Parks Canada, university researchers, but no one wants to investigate. The official position is that Sandon experiences localized weather anomalies due to unique topographical features. The snow is acknowledged, documented in meteorological records, but explained away as a curious phenomenon, nothing more. I haven't been back to Sandon, and I don't plan to return, but I think about it constantly, about that valley where snow has been falling for 70 years, about the town being slowly buried under drifts that preserve everything they cover, about the people who became snow themselves, rather than leave their homes. And I think about what the old man in New Denver told me, something I didn't fully understand at the time. The snow will keep falling, he said, until Sandon is completely buried, until every trace of the town is covered. The snow knows what it's doing. It's covering up something that should have stayed buried. I've researched Sandon's history more thoroughly since my visit, looking for what might have triggered this perpetual snowfall. I found references to a mine disaster in 1954, just before the flooding and avalanches started. 37 miners died in a collapse, and the mine was sealed without recovering all the bodies. The official report blamed unstable geology, but there were rumors of something else, that the miners had broken through into something they shouldn't have, some cavity or chamber in the mountain that released something when it was breached. The snow started falling a few months after that disaster, and it hasn't stopped. I think the snow is a response, a natural or unnatural sealing process, burying Sandon and whatever was released from that mine, covering it in layers of preservation that will keep it frozen and contained for as long as the snow keeps falling. The valley is still there, still snowing, still slowly burying what's left of the town. And if you're ever hiking in the Kootenays and you see snow falling in the middle of summer, in a valley where no snow should be, I suggest you turn around. Don't investigate, don't try to document it, don't let the drowsiness take you. Because the snow is still falling, still preserving, still transforming anyone who stays too long into sculptures of ice that will stand frozen in Sandon until the town is completely buried, until every trace of what happened there is covered in snow that never melts. Barkerville is a restored gold rush town that operates as a tourist attraction with actors in period costume, but I worked there one summer and discovered that not all the actors are employed by the historical site, and I think some of them have been performing the same roles for over 160 years. I was hired as a tour guide in 2019, fresh out of university with a history degree, and looking for summer work that would give me experience in public education and historical interpretation. Barkerville seemed perfect, a living history museum in the BC interior, recreating life during the Caribou Gold Rush of the 1860s, with restored buildings, period demonstrations, and costumed interpreters who brought the past to life for tourists. The training was comprehensive. We spent 2 weeks learning the history of the gold rush, memorizing facts about the town's founding, the lives of its residents, the boom and bust cycles that had shaped this remote mountain community. We learned the names of real historical figures who'd lived in Barkerville: Billy Barker, the prospector who'd struck the rich claim that founded the town; hurdy-gurdy girls who'd worked in the saloons; Chinese merchants who'd operated businesses on the edge of town; Judge Begbie who'd maintained law and order with legendary severity. The site employed about 40 costumed interpreters who portrayed these historical figures and others, playing roles throughout the restored town. There was the baker who made bread in a wood-fired oven, the blacksmith who demonstrated 19th century metalworking, the saloon keeper who served sarsaparilla to visitors while explaining the rowdy history of Barkerville's drinking establishments. Each interpreter had a character they portrayed, a backstory they developed, a routine they performed multiple times daily for the steady stream of tourists who visited during the summer season. I started noticing the extra actors during my second week on the job. I was leading a tour group through the main street, explaining how Barkerville had burned to the ground in 1868 and been rebuilt within 6 weeks, when I saw a woman in period costume standing in the doorway of one of the buildings. She was dressed as a shopkeeper, wearing a simple calico dress and apron, and she was watching my tour group with an expression of mild curiosity. I didn't recognize her from the staff meetings, but I assumed she was a new hire or perhaps a volunteer I hadn't met yet. After the tour, I went to introduce myself, planning to ask which character she was portraying and whether she needed any help settling into the role. But when I reached the building where I'd seen her, it was empty. The door was locked, the interior dark and vacant. I checked with the site coordinator, asking if we had a new interpreter working in that building. She looked at me strangely and said no, that building wasn't staffed, was only open for special events. I dismissed it as confusion on my part. Maybe I'd seen one of our regular staff members and misidentified which building they'd been in. But over the following weeks, I kept seeing people in period costume who didn't match any of the interpreters I knew. They were always in the background, visible at the edge of my vision or in the distance, going about activities that suggested they were part of the historical interpretation program, but that I couldn't quite connect to any scheduled demonstrations. There was a man in miner's clothing who I'd see walking toward the goldfields in the early morning, carrying tools and equipment, moving with the purposeful stride of someone heading to work. There was a Chinese man in traditional dress who appeared regularly near the Chinese section of town, sweeping the boardwalk in front of buildings that weren't currently staffed. There were children in period clothing playing in the yards between buildings, their games looking authentic and unrehearsed in ways that our child interpreters' performances never quite achieved. I started asking other staff members if they'd seen these people. Most of them brushed it off, but a few admitted they'd noticed the same thing: figures in costume who didn't match any employee they recognized, people who appeared to be part of the Living History program, but who vanished when approached. One of the older guides, a woman named Margaret who'd worked at Barkerville for over 20 years, pulled me aside after I'd mentioned seeing the children. "Don't worry about them," she said quietly. "They've always been here. They're just part of the place. They don't bother anyone, don't interfere with our work. We've learned to ignore them." I asked her what she meant, who they were. She shook her head. "Just leave it alone. Management doesn't like us talking about it. Officially, you're seeing other staff members, volunteers, maybe visitors in costume. That's the explanation. Don't dig deeper." But I couldn't leave it alone. I started paying closer attention to the extra actors, trying to track their movements, to understand their patterns. The man I'd been seeing heading to the goldfields appeared every morning around 6 a.m., visible from my apartment window in the staff housing. He walked the same route, carrying the same equipment, moving with the same steady pace. I tried following him once, but he disappeared around a corner, and when I reached that spot seconds later, he was gone, vanished into the empty morning town with no trace. The children played most afternoons, visible in the areas between the main buildings where tourists rarely went. Their games looked period-appropriate: tag, marbles, simple activities that children in the 1860s would have played. But they never acknowledged my presence, never responded when I called out to them, and they dissolved like morning mist if I approached too directly. I started documenting what I saw, taking photographs whenever I spotted one of the extra actors. But the photos never captured them clearly. They'd appear as blurs or shadows, or simply wouldn't show up at all in images that clearly depicted the buildings and locations where I'd seen them standing. About 6 weeks into my employment, I had an experience that convinced me these weren't staff members or volunteers. I was closing up the courthouse building after the last tour of the day, around 6 p.m. on a Thursday in late July. The building was one of the larger structures, containing the courtroom where Judge Begbie had presided, along with several office spaces and holding cells. I was doing my final walkthrough, checking that windows were secured and interpretive materials were put away, when I heard voices from the courtroom. I assumed it was staff members who hadn't left yet, maybe practicing a new interpretation or discussing modifications to their performances. But when I entered the courtroom, I found it occupied by people I'd never seen before: a judge in formal robes sitting at the bench, a defendant standing before him, several observers in the gallery, all of them dressed in perfect 1860s period costume and engaged in what appeared to be an actual court proceeding. The judge was speaking, his voice carrying the authority of his position, laying out the charges against the defendant in formal Victorian legal language. The defendant was responding, offering his defense, and the observers were reacting appropriately to the testimony. It was the most authentic period interpretation I'd ever witnessed: the language, the mannerisms, the genuine tension of a legal proceeding where something real was at stake. I stood in the doorway watching, transfixed by the quality of the performance. But after a minute, I realized something was wrong. The people in the courtroom weren't performing for an audience. They weren't projecting their voices or playing to observers. They were simply conducting a trial, as if this were a real legal proceeding happening in 1860s Barkerville, as if I weren't standing there watching them, as if this were their present reality. I stepped further into the room, intending to ask who they were and what production they were rehearsing. The moment I spoke, they vanished. Not gradually, not by exiting through doors, they simply ceased to exist, disappeared mid-sentence, leaving the courtroom empty and silent except for the echo of my own voice. I stood there for several minutes, my heart pounding, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. I checked the courtroom thoroughly: no other exits, no places they could have hidden, no equipment that could have produced the elaborate illusion I'd witnessed. The room was empty, had been empty, showed no evidence that anyone except me had been there. I reported the incident to management the next day, describing what I'd seen in the courtroom. The site director listened patiently, then explained that we employed several theater companies to perform special interpretations after regular hours, that I'd probably witnessed a rehearsal for one of these programs. But when I asked which company, which program, she couldn't give me specifics, just vague references to rotating performances and varied schedules. Other staff members had similar experiences. We started comparing notes quietly, sharing stories of encountering the extra actors in situations that couldn't be explained by scheduled programming or volunteer activities. One guide had seen an entire dance in the saloon at midnight, complete with music and laughter, that disappeared the moment she opened the door. Another had watched a funeral procession move through the main street at dawn, mourners following a casket toward the cemetery, all of them dressed in black period clothing, all of them vanishing before they reached the graveyard. The encounters intensified as summer progressed into fall. By September, when the tourist season was winding down, I was seeing the extra actors almost daily. They appeared more solid, more present, as if the thinning crowds of visitors allowed them to manifest more completely. I'd see the shopkeeper woman I'd noticed in my second week, now clearly visible inside her building, arranging goods on shelves, sweeping floors, going through the routines of operating a 19th century store, even though that building was officially closed to the public. I'd see the miner not just in the morning but throughout the day, returning from the goldfields covered in mud, stopping at the saloon, walking to a boarding house that had been part of historical Barkerville, but that didn't exist in the restored town. He'd walk right through where a modern building stood, completely unaware that the geography he was navigating didn't match the current reality. The children were everywhere by late September, playing in yards, running through streets, attending the schoolhouse that we use for interpretive programs, but that they seemed to occupy in a different time. I could hear their laughter, their calls to each other, their voices speaking in accents and using slang from the 1860s that no modern child interpreter would have mastered so completely. On my last day of the season, a cold October afternoon when we were preparing to close the site for winter, I had the experience that made me understand what was really happening in Barkerville. I was doing final checks on one of the residential buildings, a house that had belonged to a prosperous merchant family in the 1860s, and that was furnished with period-appropriate items to show visitors how middle-class families had lived during the gold rush. I entered the house around 5 p.m., after the last visitors had left. The front room was arranged as a parlor, with Victorian furniture and decorations, and seated around a table in the center of the room was a family of 5 parents and 3 children, all dressed in 1860s clothing, having dinner together. They were completely solid, completely real, indistinguishable from living people. The father was carving a roast, the mother was serving vegetables, the children were talking and laughing, the family engaging in ordinary dinner conversation. I could smell the food, could hear the scrape of silverware on plates, could see the steam rising from the dishes. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching them. They were unaware of my presence, completely absorbed in their meal and their conversation. I listened carefully, trying to understand what they were saying, but their words didn't make sense. They were speaking English, but in accents and rhythms from another era, discussing people and events from the 1860s as if they were current news, talking about the gold yields from claims that had played out over a century ago. I watched them for maybe 5 minutes, documenting every detail I could observe. They showed no awareness of the modern world, no acknowledgement that over 160 years had passed since the time period they were living in. They existed in 1860s Barkerville, in a version of the town that operated alongside our restored historical site, but in a different temporal layer. Eventually, I backed out of the room quietly, leaving them to their dinner. I reported what I'd seen to the site director, and she gave me the same explanation she'd given before: special programming, theater companies, varied schedules, but I knew that wasn't true. No modern actors could have produced what I'd witnessed. No theater company could have created the absolute authenticity of that family dinner, the perfect period detail, the complete immersion in 1860s reality. I think Barkerville has 2 populations. There are those of us who work there, who portray historical figures for educational purposes, who go home at the end of our shifts. And there are the others, the original residents who never left, who continue to live their gold rush lives in buildings that have been restored and preserved, who exist in a Barkerville that occupies the same physical space as our tourist attraction, but that exists in 1860s time. The restoration of the town may have done more than just preserve buildings and artifacts. I think it created conditions that allow the past to persist, that give the original residents a stable environment in which to continue their existence. The historical accuracy we strive for, the period furnishings, the authentic demonstrations, all of it may serve to strengthen whatever allows them to remain, to make the boundary between their time and ours more permeable. I've stayed in touch with some of the other staff members who worked that season, and they've confirmed that the extra actors are still there, still visible to those who pay attention, still going about their routines in the background of the tourist attraction. Management still denies it, still explains away every sighting as misidentified staff or scheduled programming, but those of us who worked there know the truth. Barkerville isn't just a restored ghost town. It's a place where the past never fully ended, where the gold rush era continues in parallel with our present, where some of the residents who lived through the boom times of the 1860s are still there, still prospecting, still running businesses, still raising families in a town that burned down and was abandoned, but that continues to exist for those who never left. I won't be going back to work there. The experience was too unsettling, the boundary between past and present too thin, the sense of two realities occupying the same space too disturbing. But I think about it constantly, about the woman in the shop, the miner heading to the gold fields, the children playing in the yards, the family having dinner in that restored house. They're still there, living their lives in 1860s Barkerville, completely unaware that tourists walk through their streets every summer, that guides like me lead tours past their homes and businesses, that the town they knew has been preserved and restored but exists now primarily as a museum. They continue their gold rush existence, trapped or choosing to remain in the time when Barkerville was at its peak, when the town was alive with possibility and gold, when the future seemed bright and the boom would never end. And they'll be there as long as Barkerville stands, as long as the buildings are maintained and the historical interpretation continues, as long as we preserve that little piece of 1860s BC in the mountains of the Caribou. The actors who stay aren't on any payroll, don't go home at the end of their shifts, don't age or change or leave. They're permanent residents of a town that exists in two times at once, visible to those who look carefully, continuing their performances in a production that's been running for over 160 years, and that will run until Barkerville finally crumbles back into the earth from which its gold was taken. Ocean Falls was a thriving company town of 5,000 people until the pulp mill closed in 1980, and now it's nearly abandoned except for about 5 permanent residents, and it rains there every single day in patterns that don't match any weather system, and I think the rain is trying to tell me something that no one wants me to know. I'm a journalist, specializing in stories about abandoned industrial communities in British Columbia, documenting the human cost of resource extraction and the ghost towns left behind when the resources run out or the economics change. Ocean Falls had been on my list for years, one of the most remote and most thoroughly abandoned communities in the province, accessible only by boat or float plane, a company town that went from boom to complete bust in the span of a few years. The statistics were staggering. At its peak in the 1960s and 70s, Ocean Falls had a population of over 5,000, all of them dependent on the pulp mill that Crown Zellerbach operated there. The company had built an entire town to support the mill houses, schools, a hospital, shopping center, recreation facilities, everything needed for a self-contained community in one of the most isolated parts of the BC coast. Then in 1980, citing economic pressures and aging equipment, the company closed the mill. Within a few years, nearly everyone had left. By the time I visited in 2023, the permanent population was down to 5 people who maintained the few buildings that were still habitable and served as caretakers for the massive infrastructure slowly being reclaimed by the rainforest. I took the BC Ferries route to Bella Bella and then arranged for a water taxi to take me the rest of the way to Ocean Falls. The approach by water is spectacular. The town sits at the head of a deep fjord, surrounded by mountains that rise straight out of the ocean, covered in dense, temperate rainforest. As we got closer, I could see the abandoned buildings climbing the hillside rows of houses, the massive shopping center, the old hotel, all of them empty, windows broken, slowly succumbing to the relentless rain and vegetation. And it was raining. Not just raining, but pouring. A heavy downpour that my boat captain said was completely normal for Ocean Falls. It rains every day here, he told me. Sometimes lighter, sometimes heavier, but it never stops. Over 4,000 millimeters a year, one of the wettest places on Earth. He dropped me at the dock and promised to return in 3 days to pick me up, then quickly departed, leaving me alone in the downpour. I'd arranged to stay in one of the few maintained buildings, a small house that the caretakers kept in livable condition for the occasional researcher or curious visitor. I made my way there through the rain, my waterproof gear already being tested by the intensity of the downpour. The town was eerie in the rain, abandoned buildings looming on all sides, streets empty except for the occasional crow, the sound of rain on metal roofs, creating a constant percussion that drowned out almost everything else. The house was basic but functional, with power from a small hydro system and running water from one of the mountain streams. I spent the first few hours getting settled, unpacking my camera equipment, and setting up to document the town in the rain that had become its most defining characteristic. That first evening, I started to notice something odd about the rain patterns. Living in British Columbia, I was no stranger to rain. I'd experienced everything from light drizzle to torrential downpours. But the rain in Ocean Falls was different in ways I couldn't quite articulate. It fell heavily, yes, but the intensity changed at specific times with a regularity that felt wrong. At exactly 6 p.m., the rain intensified dramatically for about 15 minutes, then dropped back to its previous steady rate. At 9 p.m., the same thing happened. And at midnight, and again at 3 a.m., I started timing these intensifications, documenting the pattern. The heavy downpours occurred every 3 hours, like clockwork, with the same duration and intensity each time. No natural weather pattern behaves with that kind of mechanical precision. I checked weather data for the area, looking for some meteorological explanation, tidal effects, mountain wave patterns, anything that might cause such regular cycles. But I found nothing that could explain what I was observing. The next day, I explored the abandoned town in the rain, photographing the buildings and documenting the decay. Ocean Falls was like a time capsule from 1980. The shopping center still had merchandise on some shelves. Houses still had furniture and personal belongings. The hospital still had equipment in examination rooms. Everything was water damaged and moldy, slowly rotting in the constant humidity. But the basic structure of the community remained intact. As I moved through the empty streets, I started noticing something else strange about the rain. In certain areas, it didn't fall straight down as rain should. Instead, it moved horizontally, following specific paths through the town that had nothing to do with wind direction. I'd be standing in one spot, rain falling normally, and then I'd step into a different street and the rain would be moving sideways, flowing along the pavement like a river in the air, following a route that seemed predetermined. I tried to find patterns in these horizontal rain flows, mapping them on a diagram of the town. They seemed to follow the old shift change routes that workers would have taken from the residential areas to the mill. Rain flowed along streets that led from the houses to the shopping center, from the shopping center to the mill site, from the mill site back to the houses. It was as if the rain was retracing the movements of the workers who'd once lived here, following their daily routines in liquid form. On my second night, I witnessed something that made me question whether I was documenting a meteorological phenomenon or something far stranger. I was in the abandoned shopping center, photographing the interior with its rusted shelving and water-damaged goods, when I noticed the rain outside intensifying again, one of the regular 9 p.m. heavy downpours. But this time, as I watched through the large plate glass windows, I saw the rain do something impossible. It reversed direction. Instead of falling from the sky to the ground, drops began rising from the puddles and pavement, floating upward toward the clouds. Not all the rain, the majority still fell normally, but a significant portion defied gravity, ascending in clear violation of physical laws. I stood there watching for the full 15 minutes of the intensification, documenting it with my camera, my mind struggling to accept what my eyes were showing me. After the reversal ended and the rain returned to falling normally, I went outside to examine the areas where I'd seen the upward rain. The ground was wet but showed no unusual characteristics. The rain falling on me was normal rain, cold and heavy, soaking through my gear as rain should. But I'd seen what I'd seen, rain rising instead of falling, drops moving upward in steady streams. I tried to find the 5 permanent residents to ask them about the rain patterns, but they were elusive. I'd see evidence of their presence, lights in windows, smoke from chimneys, vehicles parked in different locations, but whenever I approached a building where I thought someone might be, I'd find it empty. It was as if they were avoiding me deliberately, staying just out of reach, unwilling to interact with an outsider who was asking too many questions. On my third and final night, I decided to stay up and observe the rain throughout its complete cycle. I set up my camera equipment in the shopping center, positioning multiple cameras to capture different views of the abandoned town. The shopping center had the best vantage point, large windows overlooking the main street, a covered area that kept my equipment dry while still giving me clear views of the rain. The midnight intensification came exactly on schedule, and again I saw the upward rain, drops rising from the ground in defiance of gravity. But this time, watching more carefully, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The rising rain wasn't random. It was forming patterns, shapes, structures in the air, and those structures looked like letters. I adjusted my camera, zooming in on the area where the upward rain was most concentrated. The water drops were arranging themselves into words, sentences, entire paragraphs written in liquid against the dark sky. The letters were crude, formed from hundreds of individual droplets, holding impossible positions in the air, but they were readable. The first message I captured was simple: "We are still here." I watched, transfixed, as the rain continued to write. More messages appeared, forming and dissolving as the drops rose and fell, creating a continuous stream of communication written in water. The mill never closed. We never left. The company lied. They sealed us in the forest. They told everyone we evacuated. We are still working. The rain is us. The rain is our voices. The rain is all that escapes. I was frantically photographing, documenting these impossible messages, my mind reeling from the implications. The rain intensification ended after 15 minutes, the upward flow ceased, and the messages dissolved back into normal rainfall. But I'd seen them, documented them, had photographic evidence of rain that wrote messages. I spent the rest of the night reviewing my footage, making sure I'd captured everything. The messages were clear in my recordings: water writing words, rain defying physics to communicate something that the remaining residents refused to discuss. I made backup copies of all my files, storing them on multiple devices, determined that this evidence wouldn't be lost. As dawn approached, I packed up my equipment and prepared for my boat pickup. I had one more hour before the water taxi was scheduled to arrive, so I decided to do one final exploration of the town to see if I could find any physical evidence that would corroborate the messages the rain had written. I hiked up toward the old mill site, following the rain as it flowed horizontally along the shift change routes. The mill buildings were massive, slowly being consumed by rust and vegetation, but still imposing in their industrial scale. And as I approached, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. Voices. Not individual voices, but a chorus. Hundreds of voices blending together, all of them saying the same thing over and over: "Still here, still working, never left." The voices were coming from the rain itself. Every drop that hit the ground, every stream running down the abandoned buildings, every puddle rippling in the downpour, all of it was whispering, speaking in voices too quiet to hear individually, but forming a collective sound that was unmistakable once you recognized it. I stood there in the rain, listening to the voices of workers who'd disappeared in 1980, who'd supposedly evacuated when the mill closed, but who'd apparently never left. The rain was their medium, their form, their only way of communicating with the outside world. Something had happened during the final days before the closure, something the company had covered up, something the few remaining residents knew but wouldn't speak about. I tried to explore further, to find the source of these voices, to discover what had really happened to the missing workers. But my water taxi arrived, horn blaring, and I had to choose between missing my ride out and investigating further. I chose to leave, planning to return with better equipment, more time, and perhaps authorities who could investigate what I'd discovered. The boat ride back was rough, rain continuing to pour even as we left Ocean Falls behind. I spent the journey reviewing my photographs and videos, preparing the story I'd write, the evidence I'd present. But when I got back to cell phone reception and tried to upload my files to cloud storage, I found they were corrupted. Every photograph, every video, every recording I'd made in Ocean Falls was damaged beyond recovery. The images were distorted, the videos showed only static, the audio recordings were garbled and unintelligible. I tried professional data recovery services, but they confirmed what I'd feared: the files were completely destroyed, corrupted in a way that suggested water damage, despite having been stored on waterproof devices that had never been submerged. It was as if the rain itself had reached into my equipment and erased everything I documented. I have no physical evidence of what I saw in Ocean Falls, just my memories, my handwritten notes, and the certainty that something terrible happened there in 1980, something that resulted in hundreds of workers being transformed into or trapped within the endless rain that falls on that abandoned town. I've tried to investigate through other means, requesting company records, searching for relatives of the workers who supposedly evacuated, looking for any documentation of what happened during those final days. But Crown Zellerbach was sold and reorganized decades ago. The records are scattered or destroyed, and the few people who might remember that time either won't talk or claim to know nothing about any irregularities. The rain still falls on Ocean Falls every day, over 4,000 millimeters per year, in patterns that defy meteorological explanation. The 5 remaining residents still maintain their silent vigil, refusing to speak to outsiders, keeping whatever secrets the town holds. And the rain continues to write its messages, continues to flow in impossible directions, continues to whisper in voices that blend together into a chorus of loss. I think about going back, about trying again to document what's happening there, to find proof of what the rain told me. But I'm afraid of what might happen if I stay too long in Ocean Falls, if I listen too carefully to the voices in the rain, if I stand in the downpour during one of those intense 15-minute periods when the rain rises instead of falls. I'm afraid that the rain might claim me too, might add my voice to the chorus of workers who never left, who were sealed in the forest or the mill or some other place when the company shut down operations. I'm afraid I might become part of the endless precipitation, falling and rising and falling again, whispering messages that no one will hear, trying to tell a story that no one wants to know. The rain falls on Ocean Falls every single day, and it has been falling continuously since 1980, and I think it will keep falling until someone listens to what it's trying to say, until someone believes the messages written in water, until someone investigates what really happened to the workers who never evacuated, who are still there, still working, still trapped in a form that's neither alive nor dead, but something in between forever, part of the rain that never stops. Antioch was a copper smelter town on the northern coast that was abandoned in 1935, and when I hiked to the ruins, I found smoke still rising from the smelter that's been cold for 90 years, and I think the workers who died there are still feeding the furnaces in a shift that will never end. I'm an industrial archaeologist, documenting the remnants of British Columbia's resource extraction history, photographing the abandoned mines and smelters and logging camps that dot the province's remote coastline. Antioch had been on my research list for years, one of the most isolated and most completely abandoned industrial sites in BC, a place that had been built and abandoned within a single generation, leaving behind ruins that few people have ever seen. The history was brutal and brief. Antioch was established in 1914 by the Granby Consolidated Mining and Smelting Company, built to process copper ore from the nearby Hidden Creek mine. At its peak in the 1920s, the town had a population of around 3,000, with all the infrastructure needed to support an isolated industrial community: houses, schools, a hospital, stores, recreational facilities. The smelter operated continuously, processing ore day and night, filling the narrow valley with smoke and the distinctive smell of burning sulfur. Then in 1935, the copper prices collapsed and the high-grade ore ran out. The company shut down operations, and within months the entire population had evacuated, leaving behind a ghost town that nature has been slowly reclaiming for nearly 90 years. Getting to Antioch requires serious planning. The site is on the northern BC coast, accessible only by boat or float plane, with no roads connecting it to anywhere inhabited. I arranged for a float plane to drop me at the old dock site and return 4 days later, giving me time to thoroughly document the ruins. The flight in was spectacular rugged coastline, dense rainforest covering the mountains, no signs of human habitation for miles. And then the pilot pointed down at a narrow inlet, and I could see the ruins of Antioch spread along the shoreline, and climbing the hillside, dozens of collapsed buildings, rusted industrial equipment, and dominating everything, the massive concrete structure of the smelter itself. As we descended toward the water, I saw something that made me lean forward in my seat, staring intently. Smoke was rising from the smelter's tall stacks, dark smoke that stood out clearly against the gray coastal sky. I pointed it out to the pilot, asking if there was any industrial activity still happening at the site. He looked where I was pointing and shrugged. "Don't see anything," he said. "The place has been dead for 90 years. But I could see it clearly thick. Dark smoke rising from the two main stacks, the kind of heavy industrial smoke that a functioning copper smelter would produce. I assumed he simply wasn't looking at the right spot, or that the angle made it difficult for him to see what I was seeing. The plane landed on the calm water of the inlet, and the pilot helped me unload my camping gear and photography equipment onto the old wooden dock that was still remarkably intact, despite decades of neglect. "You sure you want to stay here alone?" the pilot asked, looking at the ruins with obvious unease. "This place has always given me the creeps. I'll come back early if you want." I assured him I'd be fine, that I was experienced with backcountry camping and had spent weeks in more remote locations. He left reluctantly, the float plane's engine echoing off the mountains as it lifted off and disappeared around a headland, leaving me alone with the ruins and the smoke I could still see rising from the smelter stacks. I set up my base camp in one of the more intact buildings, a structure that had been some kind of administrative office based on the remnants of desks and filing cabinets. The building had a roof that was mostly sound, keeping out the constant drizzle that characterizes this part of the coast. Once my gear was secured, I grabbed my camera and headed toward the smelter, eager to investigate the smoke I'd seen from the air. The walk through the ruins was eerie. Antioch was a substantial town, and the evidence of that scale was everywhere: foundations of hundreds of houses marching up the hillside, the collapsed remains of the hospital, the rusted shell of what had been a community hall. Everything was overgrown with salal and devil's club, the characteristic plants of the coastal rainforest, but the human infrastructure was still visible beneath the vegetation, a ghost town slowly being absorbed back into nature. The smelter dominated the site. It was a massive concrete structure, several stories tall, with two main stacks rising even higher. The building was intact in its basic form. Concrete doesn't decay the way wood does, but all the equipment inside had been stripped or had rusted into unrecognizable masses. Conveyor systems were collapsed, ore bins had caved in, and the massive furnaces that had once run continuously were now just cold metal shells. But smoke was still rising from the stacks. As I got closer, I could see it clearly: dark, thick smoke pouring out of the two main chimneys, exactly the kind of smoke that a functioning copper smelter would produce. And I could smell it too, the distinctive acrid smell of sulfur and burning metal that copper smelting creates, a smell that shouldn't exist at a facility that's been cold for 90 years. I entered the smelter building carefully, watching for unstable floors and loose equipment. The interior was a cathedral of industrial decay: high ceilings, massive equipment reduced to rust, everything coated in the residue of decades of coastal rain and salt air. I explored methodically, photographing everything, looking for any source of heat or fire that could explain the smoke. The main furnaces were completely cold. I checked them thoroughly, even climbing into the firebox of the largest one to examine it from inside. No residual heat, no burning material, no sign that these furnaces had operated in living memory. The ore processing equipment was similarly dead. Conveyors rusted solid, crushers seized, roasters collapsed. There was absolutely no operational equipment, no power source, nothing that could produce the smoke I could still see rising from the stacks above me. I climbed the internal stairs to reach the level where the stacks connected to the building. The stairway was dangerous, metal treads rusted through in places, but I made it to the upper level and found the base of the smokestacks. They were massive brick-lined chimneys, designed to carry away the toxic fumes from the smelting process. And smoke was definitely flowing through them, rising from the building below and exiting through the stacks above. I could see it clearly, could smell it strongly, could feel the air movement as it rose past me. But there was no source. The smoke was simply present, flowing upward through a smelter that had been completely non-operational since 1935, rising from furnaces that were demonstrably cold and dead. I spent over an hour trying to find a rational explanation, checking for underground fires, looking for natural gas vents, examining every possible source of combustion. I found nothing. As afternoon faded toward evening, I positioned my camera equipment to document the smoke, setting up time-lapse sequences and long exposures that would capture its movement over hours. And as I worked, I started to notice something disturbing in the smoke itself. There were shapes in it, darker forms moving within the roiling clouds, patterns that suggested structure and purpose rather than random turbulence. I focused my camera on these shapes, zooming in, trying to capture detail, and gradually, as my eyes adjusted to the patterns, I began to see what was creating them. The shapes were people, human figures moving through the smoke, operating equipment, following the routines of industrial work. I could see them shoveling ore into furnaces, adjusting valves, monitoring gauges, moving through the smelter in the choreography of shifts that had run continuously during Antioch's operational years. The figures were made of smoke, or visible within the smoke, formed from the same dark vapor that rose from the stacks. They weren't solid, weren't ghosts in any traditional sense, but they were definitely present, moving with purpose, repeating tasks, engaged in the work of running a copper smelter that had been shut down 90 years ago. I watched them for hours, documenting everything, trying to understand what I was seeing. The workers looked exhausted, their movements heavy and labored, their postures suggesting bone-deep fatigue. They moved through their tasks mechanically, without pause or rest, operating equipment that existed only in the smoke, processing ore that wasn't there, feeding furnaces that were cold and empty in our reality, but that clearly burned in whatever version of time these workers occupied. As night fell, I set up a more permanent observation post in the smelter building, positioning my cameras to capture different angles and using infrared equipment to see if the smoke workers were visible in other spectrums. They showed up clearly in infrared, appearing as heat signatures despite the smelter being demonstrably cold, suggesting they existed in some thermal reality that didn't correspond to our physical measurements. I tried to count them, to estimate how many workers were visible in the smoke. I identified at least 30 distinct figures, all of them engaged in different tasks related to smelter operation. Some worked the furnaces, others operated the ore processing equipment, still others monitored the complex chemistry of copper extraction. They moved through shifts that seemed to run continuously, with no breaks, no rest periods, no end to their labor. Around midnight, I witnessed something that made me understand the true horror of what I was documenting. One of the smoke workers collapsed, falling near a furnace, his form dissipating slightly as he hit the ground. Other workers moved toward him, and I thought they would help him, would carry him away for medical attention. Instead, they picked up his smoke form and fed it into the furnace, the same way they would feed coal or ore. The figure went into the fire, his form burning brighter for a moment, and then new smoke rose from the stacked smoke that reformed into a worker who immediately returned to his task, the same task the collapsed worker had been performing. I watched this happen 3 more times during the night. Workers would collapse from exhaustion, would be fed into the furnaces by their colleagues, and would emerge as new smoke to continue the work. The smelter wasn't just showing me the past, it was consuming the workers, burning them as fuel, creating smoke from their labor and their bodies, and using that smoke to perpetuate their work in an endless cycle. By dawn, I was exhausted and disturbed, but I had documented hours of this impossible activity. I reviewed my footage, confirming that the cameras had captured what I'd seen: the smoke workers, their movements, their collapse and consumption and reformation. The evidence was clear and detailed, showing activity that violated every physical law I knew, but that was undeniably present in the ruins of this abandoned smelter. I spent my second day exploring the rest of the town site, looking for additional evidence of what had happened here. In the ruins of the hospital, I found medical records that had somehow survived 9 decades of weather reports of workers suffering from exhaustion, from respiratory problems caused by the constant smoke exposure, from accidents in the smelter that were noted clinically, but that suggested horrific working conditions. I found death certificates documenting workers who had died in industrial accidents crushed by equipment, burned in furnace explosions, overcome by toxic fumes. 37 deaths during Antioch's 20 years of operation, a casualty rate that seemed impossibly high until I read the details and understood the brutal conditions workers had endured. And I found a note in the hospital administrator's files, dated from early 1935, just before the shutdown. It described workers who had started showing up for their shifts even after they died, who continued operating equipment despite being dead, who were buried but who appeared again in the smelter, working their positions as if they'd never left. The administrator attributed it to exhaustion-induced hallucinations, to the toxic fumes affecting people's perceptions. But I knew what I'd seen in the smoke. Those dead workers had never stopped working. The smelter had claimed them, had consumed them, had made them part of its eternal operation. On my third night, I returned to the smelter for a final observation session. The smoke workers were still there, still operating the cold equipment, still feeding the empty furnaces, still collapsing and being consumed and reforming to continue their labor. I watched one particular worker, a figure I'd identified by his distinctive movements, and I timed his cycle. Every 3 hours and 17 minutes, he would collapse from exhaustion, be fed into the furnace, emerge as new smoke, and return to work. Eternally dying, eternally being consumed, eternally returning to the same task. I tried calling out to them, tried to communicate with the smoke workers to see if they were aware of their situation, if they knew they were trapped in a cycle that had been repeating for 90 years. But they showed no awareness of my presence, no reaction to my shouts. They existed in their own temporal layer, locked into the routines of 1935, unable to see or hear anything beyond the smelter and their endless work. On my final day, before the float plane returned to pick me up, I hiked to the cemetery where Anyox had buried its dead. I found the graves of the 37 workers who had died during the town's operation, simple markers noting their names and dates of death. And I found something that confirmed my worst fears. Several of the graves showed signs of having been disturbed from below, as if something had pushed up from underneath, as if the buried workers had tried to claw their way out to return to their shifts at the smelter. When the pilot returned, I loaded my equipment quickly, eager to leave Anyox behind. As we lifted off, I looked back at the smelter and saw the smoke still rising from the stacks, still carrying the forms of workers who would never rest, who would continue their labor until the concrete structure finally crumbles and releases them from their industrial purgatory. I've tried to share what I found at Anyox, tried to show people the footage I captured, tried to get researchers to investigate the phenomenon, but the smoke workers don't show up on the video I recorded. The cameras captured the smoke rising from the stacks, but the figures within it, the workers I watched for hours, don't appear in any of my footage. The evidence I have is purely observational, purely my testimony, and no one believes me. The smelter at Anyox still stands, still produces smoke from furnaces that have been cold for 90 years, still operates in a version of time that runs parallel to ours, but that doesn't correspond to our reality. The workers who died there are still trapped in their shifts, still being consumed by the furnaces, still emerging as smoke to continue their labor. They will work until the end of time, until the smelter finally falls, until someone finds a way to release them from the industrial hell they've been locked in since 1935. The smoke rises every day from those stacks, visible to anyone who looks carefully, but most people don't see it, don't want to see it, don't want to acknowledge that some places of labor and death never truly shut down, that some workers never get to punch out and go home, that some industries consume not just the living but the dead as well, burning them as fuel in furnaces that will never go cold. The abandoned gold mining town of Headley has a network of tunnels that run through the mountains, and I entered one of those tunnels and walked for 3 hours in a tunnel that official maps say is only half a mile long, and I don't think I was walking through normal space anymore. I'm a mining historian, documenting the abandoned gold operations that dot the mountains of southern British Columbia, photographing the infrastructure and equipment before it disappears completely to rust and rockfall. Headley had been one of the richest gold camps in BC, the nickel plate mine operating from the 1890s until 1996, pulling millions of dollars worth of gold from the mountain above the small town. The town itself clings to the side of a steep valley, houses and businesses built on terraces carved from the mountainside, with the old mining facilities looming above on even steeper slopes. The main mine complex is accessible by a winding road that switchbacks up the mountain, past the old processing mills and ore bins, ending at the portal of the nickel plate mine itself. I'd gotten permission from the current property owners to photograph the site, with the understanding that I wouldn't enter any of the tunnels since they hadn't been maintained or inspected in decades and were potentially unstable. I spent my first day photographing the surface facilities, the massive ore bins where rock had been stored before processing, the mill buildings where gold had been extracted from crushed ore, the tramway system that had carried materials up and down the mountain. The scale of the operation was impressive, even in its abandoned state. testament to the wealth that had been pulled from this mountain over a century of mining. On my second day, I hiked to the upper reaches of the mine complex, where several tunnel portals led into the mountain. Most were sealed with concrete or steel gates, blocked off for safety and to prevent unauthorized entry. But one tunnel, a drift that ran horizontally into the mountainside, was only partially secured. A chain-link fence with a "Danger, do not enter" sign covered the portal, but someone had cut a gap in the fence large enough to squeeze through. I stood at the opening, shining my flashlight into the darkness beyond. The tunnel looked stable, good timber supports, solid rock walls, narrow-gauge rail tracks still in place running into the mountain. According to the mine maps I'd reviewed, this particular drift extended only half a mile into the mountain, ending at a worked-out ore body that had been exhausted in the 1940s. A short tunnel, well within my capability to explore and photograph if I was careful. I'd brought proper equipment for this kind of exploration: a powerful headlamp with spare batteries, a GPS unit, emergency supplies, and a length of rope in case I needed to mark my route. I checked my watch, 10:37 a.m., and entered the tunnel, squeezing through the gap in the fence and stepping onto the rail tracks that led into the darkness. The tunnel was about 8 feet high and 12 feet wide, dimensions that made walking comfortable. The air was cool and slightly damp, carrying the mineral smell that's characteristic of hard rock mines. My headlamp illuminated the walls, showing competent rock with good timber sets every 10 feet or so, the kind of professional mining work that suggested this tunnel had been maintained and used regularly during the mine's operation. I walked at a steady pace, photographing as I went, documenting the construction techniques and the condition of the timber supports. The rail tracks ran straight ahead, parallel rails about 2 feet apart, designed for the small ore carts that would have hauled rock out of the mine. Every few hundred feet I'd pass a side tunnel or alcove where equipment had been stored, or where miners had carved out space for ventilation or water drainage. After what felt like 15 minutes, I checked my GPS to see how far I'd traveled. According to the unit, I'd covered about half a mile, which meant I should be approaching the end of the tunnel. But ahead of me, my headlamp showed only more tunnel, the same dimensions, the same rail tracks, no indication that I was approaching a dead end. I kept walking, expecting to reach the tunnel's terminus at any moment, but the tunnel just continued, extending beyond where the map said it should end. I checked my GPS again. It showed me as being 0.7 miles from the entrance, which should have put me well beyond the tunnel's documented extent and into solid rock that had never been excavated. I stopped and considered turning back, but I was curious now, wanting to understand what I was seeing. The tunnel showed no signs of changing: the same rock walls, the same timber supports, the same rail tracks. It was as if the half-mile tunnel I'd entered had somehow extended itself, continuing into the mountain far beyond its documented length. I decided to walk for another 15 minutes, just to see how far the tunnel went. I marked my position with a piece of reflective tape on one of the timber sets, ensuring I'd recognize where I'd made the decision to continue. Then I kept walking, my headlamp beam cutting through the darkness ahead. The tunnel remained absolutely consistent. Same dimensions, same construction, same rail tracks. Every 10 feet, another timber set. Every few hundred feet, another side alcove. But no variation, no change that would indicate I was progressing through different sections of the mine. It was as if I was walking through the same repeating segment of tunnel, experiencing the same space over and over. I checked my watch, 11:12 a.m. I'd been walking for 35 minutes, which at my pace should have taken me well over a mile into the mountain. My GPS confirmed this, showing me at 1.3 miles from the entrance. According to the mine maps, there was nothing at this location, just solid mountain. Yet I was clearly in a constructed tunnel, walking on rail tracks, passing under professionally installed timber supports. I kept walking, now committed to finding the end of this impossible tunnel. My mind cycled through potential explanations. Maybe the maps were wrong. Maybe there were extensions to the mine that hadn't been documented. Maybe I was disoriented and was actually walking in circles. But none of these explanations felt right. The tunnel ran straight. The GPS showed linear progress away from the entrance, and the construction was too consistent to be a series of separate drifts. After an hour of walking, I stopped to rest and reassess. According to my GPS, I was now over 2 miles inside the mountain, far beyond any documented mining activity in this area. I should have been in solid rock, Yet the tunnel continued ahead, showing no signs of ending. I ate a snack and drank some water, trying to decide whether to push forward or turn back. The tunnel felt different here, though I couldn't quite articulate how. The air was the same temperature, the rock walls looked identical, the timber supports were spaced the same way, but there was a quality to the space that felt wrong, as if the normal rules of distance and progression didn't apply. I felt like I could walk forever in this tunnel and never reach an end, just continue through this repeating segment of underground space indefinitely. I decided to walk for 1 more hour, then turn back regardless of whether I found the tunnel's end. I marked my position again with reflective tape and continued forward. The tunnel remained maddeningly consistent, offering no variation that would help me understand what was happening. I tried counting the timber sets, tried looking for any changes in the rock type or the quality of construction, but everything remained the same. At the 2-hour mark, I checked my GPS again. It showed me at 4.2 miles from the entrance, deep inside a mountain that the mind map showed as solid rock. I was walking in a space that shouldn't exist, following rail tracks through a tunnel that extended far beyond any physical possibility. And then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. On one of the timber sets ahead of me, I saw a piece of reflective tape, the same kind I'd been using to mark my position. I approached it carefully, and my stomach dropped when I recognized it as the marker I'd placed an hour ago, when I'd been at the 1-mile point according to my GPS. I was back at a position I'd passed an hour earlier, despite my GPS showing continuous forward progress. Either the tunnel was somehow looping back on itself in ways that violated spatial geometry, or my GPS was malfunctioning in ways that made no sense. I checked the unit carefully. It showed a clear path from the entrance to my current position, a straight line extending 4.2 miles into the mountain. But I was standing at a marker I'd placed when the GPS showed me at 1.3 miles. I started walking again, this time moving faster, anxiety building. I passed more markers I recognized, pieces of tape I'd placed earlier, all of them appearing in sequence, as if I was retracing my route. But my GPS continued to show forward progress, the distance from the entrance increasing with every step. After 3 hours of walking, I was exhausted and thoroughly disturbed. My GPS showed me at nearly 7 miles from the entrance, but I was seeing markers I'd placed at various points during my journey, suggesting I was somehow traveling in circles while the GPS recorded linear progress. The tunnel continued ahead, unchanging, offering no exit, no variation, just more of the same repeating space. I decided to turn back. I'd gone far enough, documented enough of this impossible tunnel. I turned around and started walking back toward the entrance, following my headlamp beam in the opposite direction. And immediately, the tunnel felt different. The oppressive sense of endlessness lifted, replaced by a normal feeling of traveling through a defined space with a clear destination. I walked for 15 minutes, moving at the same pace I'd maintained during my 3-hour journey inward. And at the 15-minute mark, I saw daylight ahead the entrance to the tunnel, exactly where I'd entered 3 hours earlier. I checked my GPS, and it confirmed I'd covered about half a mile, the exact documented length of the tunnel according to the mind maps. I emerged into sunlight, squeezing back through the gap in the chain-link fence, and stood outside the portal, trying to process what I'd experienced. I'd walked for 3 hours at a steady pace, covering what should have been 6 or 7 miles according to normal rates of travel. My GPS had recorded that distance, had shown me progressing miles into the mountain, but the return journey had taken only 15 minutes, covering the documented half-mile length of the tunnel. I checked my watch 1:52 p.m. 3 hours and 15 minutes had elapsed since I'd entered the tunnel. That time was real, documented, measurable. But the space I'd traveled didn't correspond to any physical reality. The tunnel had extended itself, or I'd traveled through folded space, or distance had become elastic inside that mountain. I spent the rest of the afternoon researching the nickel plate mine's history, looking for any references to unusual spatial phenomena or tunnels that extended beyond their documented lengths. I found old miners' accounts that mentioned certain drifts where distances didn't feel right, where walks that should have taken minutes seemed to take hours, where miners would emerge from shifts exhausted from walking far more than their work locations should have required. I found references to ore bodies discovered in locations that shouldn't have existed according to the geological surveys, rich deposits found in areas where the rock type was wrong and the depth was impossible. The miners hadn't questioned it too closely, they were finding gold, and that was what mattered. But reading between the lines of the old reports, I could see hints that they knew something was wrong with the geometry of the mountain, that their mine extended into spaces that violated normal spatial rules. I went back to the tunnel entrance one more time before leaving Headley. I stood at the portal, shining my flashlight into the darkness, and I could see the tunnel extending ahead, the rail tracks running into the mountain. But I didn't enter again. I'd experienced enough of that impossible space, had walked far enough through a tunnel that reached distances it shouldn't contain. I think the nickel plate mine discovered something in that mountain, some quality of the rock or some anomaly in space that allowed their tunnels to extend far beyond what physics should permit. I think the miners used it, exploited it, followed those impossible tunnels to ore deposits that couldn't exist in normal geology. And I think that tunnel is still there, still extending into folded space, still offering to take anyone who enters on a journey that won't make sense, that will seem to last for hours, but that will compress back to normal distance when you turn around. The tunnel exists in the mountain above Headley, half a mile long according to the maps, but extending for miles when you walk it, reaching into space that folds and compresses, that doesn't follow the normal rules of distance and direction. And if you ever find yourself in an old mine tunnel that seems to go on longer than it should, that takes you deeper than the maps say is possible, I suggest you turn back before you walk too far. Because some tunnels don't just go into mountains, they go into spaces between normal geometry, into folded reality, where distance becomes meaningless, and where you might walk forever through the same repeating segment of underground space, never finding an end, never reaching the ore deposits or the exit or anything except more tunnel, extending endlessly into a mountain that's bigger on the inside than any mountain has a right to be. I was researching a ghost town called Granite City in the Tulameen Valley, and I found photographs in an abandoned building showing the town's present day, taken from the future, and in those photographs, I could see myself documenting a version of Granite City that hasn't collapsed yet. I'm a freelance photographer, specializing in documenting British Columbia's abandoned settlements, creating visual records of these places before they disappear completely. Granite City had been on my list for years, a gold rush town that boomed briefly in the 1890s, peaked at maybe 2,000 people, and then died just as quickly when the easy gold ran out and the prospectors moved on to the next strike. The town is located in the Tulameen Valley in southern BC, accessible by logging roads that require a four-wheel drive vehicle and some comfort with remote wilderness travel. I made the drive on a clear September morning, following directions I'd pieced together from old mining reports and recent hiking blogs. The final approach was on foot, a 2-kilometer hike through dense forest, following what had been the main wagon road into town. Granite City appeared gradually through the trees. First the collapsed remains of what had been a hotel, then a few standing walls of other buildings, and finally the town's core, a cluster of maybe 8 structures in various stages of collapse. Most were just foundations and scattered timbers, reclaimed by the forest, but 3 buildings still stood mostly intact, their walls and roofs holding despite over a century of weather and neglect. I spent the morning photographing the ruins, documenting the construction techniques, capturing the details of how these frontier buildings were slowly returning to the earth. The largest standing structure was a 2-story building that had probably been a store or trading post based on its size and central location. The ground floor was relatively accessible, though the floor was spongy and unreliable in places, and I moved carefully as I photographed the interior. The second floor was reached by an exterior staircase that looked distinctly unsafe, but I'm experienced with unstable structures and made it up carefully, testing each step before committing my weight. The upper floor had been divided into several small rooms, probably living quarters for the store's owner and family or rental rooms for miners. Most of the rooms were empty except for debris and the accumulated leaves and dirt of decades, but one room at the back still had some furniture, a collapsed bed frame, a broken chair, and what looked like it had been a dresser now reduced to scattered boards. I was photographing the dresser when I noticed a shoebox tucked into a corner behind where the furniture had fallen. The box was relatively new, made of modern cardboard, definitely not an artifact from the 1890s. I picked it up carefully, expecting to find maybe some hiker supplies or geocaching materials, the kind of thing that occasionally gets left in abandoned places. Instead, I found photographs. The box was full of them, maybe 60 or 70 prints, all modern photo prints on the kind of paper you'd get from any photo lab or home printer, I pulled out the first few, and my confusion immediately deepened. The photos showed Granite City, but not as I'd been seeing it. They showed the buildings intact, freshly painted, well-maintained. The streets were clean, the structures looked cared for, and in several photos I could see people walking through town, all of them dressed in 1890s period clothing. I flipped through more photos, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These were clearly modern photographs. The print quality, the paper type, the color saturation all indicated recent processing. Several had development stamps on the back showing dates from the past 5 years. But they depicted Granite City as it would have looked in its prime, as if someone had traveled back in time and photographed the town at the height of the gold rush. Except the photos weren't historical recreations. I recognized several of the angles and vantage points. They were the exact same spots I'd been standing earlier that morning, photographing the ruined buildings. Someone had stood in those same locations and photographed these buildings. But in their photographs, the buildings weren't ruins. They were intact, functional, occupied. I sat down on the floor, my hands shaking slightly as I continued examining the photographs. The detail was extraordinary. I could see curtains in windows, goods displayed in store windows, horses tied to hitching posts. The people in the photos looked entirely natural, not posed or staged like historical reenactors would be. They were going about their business, walking down the street, entering buildings, having conversations completely unaware they were being photographed or completely indifferent to the photographer's presence. And then I saw myself. In a photograph showing the main street of Granite City, with the store building prominent in the center, there was a figure in the background holding a camera. I looked closer, my heart starting to pound. The figure was wearing jeans and a blue hiking jacket, exactly what I was currently wearing. The figure had my build, my posture, my camera equipment. It was me, photographed from behind, documenting the intact buildings of Granite City. I found myself in 3 more photographs, each one showing me from different angles, photographing different buildings, all of which appeared intact and well-maintained in these images. In one particularly clear shot, I could see my face in profile as I adjusted my camera settings, and there was no doubt it was absolutely me, wearing the clothes I was currently wearing, doing exactly what I'd been doing that morning, but in a version of Granite City that wasn't ruined. I checked the development stamps on the backs of the photos that showed me. They were dated from 2 months in the future, November 2023. I was looking at photographs that hadn't been taken yet, photographs of a visit I hadn't made yet, to a version of Granite City that didn't exist in the ruined forest around me. I spent over an hour examining every photograph in the box, trying to find some explanation that made sense. The photos were too detailed, too consistent to be elaborate fakes. The lighting was natural, the shadows correct for the time of day and season. The people in the photos cast shadows, their reflections appeared in windows. They interacted with the environment in ways that would be nearly impossible to fabricate convincingly. I took several of the photos outside to compare them directly with the current state of the buildings. I stood in the exact spot where one photo had been taken and held it up, comparing the image to what I could see. In the photo, the store building was pristine, fresh paint, intact windows, a sign above the door advertising goods and services. In reality, the building was weathered gray wood, windows long broken, the roof sagging dangerously. But the architectural details were identical, the same door frame, the same window placement, the same building, but in 2 completely different states. I returned to the room where I'd found the shoebox and searched more carefully, looking for anything else that might explain these photographs. In a gap between floorboards, I found a note, handwritten on modern paper. The handwriting was neat and precise, and the message was simple but deeply disturbing. The photographs document what persists. Granite City never fully left. You're seeing both versions now. The ruins are where your time intersects with it. The photographs show where the other time continues. You'll understand when you develop your own photos. I stayed in Granite City for the rest of the day, photographing compulsively, documenting everything from every angle, trying to capture what the mysterious photographer had captured. The ruined buildings remained ruins in my viewfinder. The forest continued to reclaim the town site. Nothing changed in the reality I could see and touch. But I kept thinking about those photographs, about seeing myself in images that were dated 2 months in the future. When I left that evening, I took the shoebox of photographs with me. I know I probably shouldn't have, they weren't mine. They'd been left in that building for some reason, but I needed to study them more carefully to understand what they were showing me. Over the following weeks, I examined the photographs obsessively. I had them analyzed by a photography expert who confirmed they were genuine prints, not manipulated or composited. The paper was standard photo paper. The development process was normal. There was no evidence of digital manipulation. They were real photographs of something, even if that something didn't match the current state of Granite City. I researched the town's history more thoroughly, looking for any accounts of unusual phenomena or reports of the town appearing intact long after it had been abandoned. I found scattered references in old journals and letters prospectors who'd passed through the valley decades after Granite City was abandoned, reporting seeing lights in the buildings at night, hearing the sounds of a functioning town, encountering people in period dress who claimed to be residents of a thriving mining community. Most of these accounts were dismissed as tall tales or mistakes, people seeing the ruins and imagining them occupied, or encountering historical reenactors or squatters. But reading them after seeing those photographs, I recognized the consistency of the descriptions. People were seeing an intact Granite City, populated and operational, existing in the same location as the ruins but in some kind of parallel state. 2 months after my initial visit, in November, as the development stamps had indicated, I returned to Granite City. I hiked in on a gray morning, the forest quiet with the approach of winter. The town looked exactly as it had in September, the same ruined buildings, the same encroaching forest, no change in the physical reality. I spent the day photographing again, standing in the same locations where I'd stood before, where the mysterious photographs had shown me standing. I documented everything methodically, taking hundreds of photos from every angle. The buildings remained ruins in my viewfinder, but I had this persistent feeling of being watched, of other eyes observing me while I worked. When I developed the photos from that November visit, my blood ran cold. Among the images of ruins and forest, there were photographs showing intact buildings. Not all of them, most, still showed the decay and collapse I'd seen through my viewfinder, but scattered throughout my collection were images showing Granite City as it had appeared in the mysterious photographs. Clean streets, maintained buildings, and in several shots, people in 1890s clothing going about their business. I hadn't seen any of this while I was there. My camera had captured something that wasn't visible to my eyes, or had captured moments when the boundary between the ruined Granite City and the intact version had been thin enough for the camera to see through. And in one photograph, I saw the person who'd taken the original photos I'd found, a figure standing on the second floor of the store building, visible in a window, photographing the street below. The figure was holding a camera aimed toward where I'd been standing, capturing images that I now understood would be the photographs I'd found in the shoebox photographs of me documenting a town that existed in 2 states simultaneously. I've been back to Granite City 3 more times since that November visit. Each time, I find new photographs in the shoebox in that upstairs room, photographs dated from progressively further in the future, showing me on visits I haven't made yet, documenting a town that's simultaneously abandoned and thriving, ruined and intact, dead and alive. The most recent photographs I found show me in the middle of winter, photographing Granite City in the snow. The buildings in these images are pristine, smoke rising from chimneys, townspeople walking through snow-covered streets in their 1890s winter clothing. And in the background of one image, I can see the photographer who's been documenting me standing in the window of that second-floor room, camera raised, capturing my future visit to this impossible town. I don't know who the photographer is, or how they're taking pictures from the future, or why they're documenting my visits to Granite City. I don't know if the intact version of the town is a ghost of the past bleeding into the present, or a parallel timeline where Granite City never died, or something else entirely that I don't have the framework to understand. What I do know is that Granite City exists in multiple states, simultaneously ruined in the forest, and thriving in some other layer of reality that occasionally becomes visible, photographable, partially accessible. I know that every time I visit, someone is documenting me from that other version, taking photographs that will exist before I've even made the visit they depict. And I know that the photographs in that shoebox extend further into the future than I've seen yet. The dates go forward months, years, showing visits I haven't made to a town that will continue to exist in both states, collapsed and intact, abandoned and occupied, dead and alive for as long as people like me keep coming to document what's left, never realizing that what's left isn't gone at all, just existing in a different version of now that cameras can capture but eyes usually can't see. The shoebox is still there, in that upstairs room in Granite City. Every time I visit, there are new photographs, documenting visits I haven't made yet, showing me a town that never fully died, populated by people who never fully left, existing in an 1890s that never fully ended, but that continues parallel to our present, visible only in photographs that show what persists when a place refuses to become just a ruin, when time doesn't flow in a single direction but branches and overlaps, creating multiple versions of the same location existing side by side, separated by nothing more than a thin boundary that cameras can sometimes cross. There's an abandoned company town called Bradian, where a mining company built an entire community in the 1960s and then abandoned it in the 1970s. And there's a bell in the town square that rings every day at 5 p.m. even though no one's there to ring it, and I think it's calling workers who never left. I'm a photographer documenting British Columbia's abandoned resource towns. Those communities built by mining and logging companies to house their workers in remote locations, then abandoned when the economics changed or the resources ran out. Bradian had always intrigued me because of how complete it still was, an entire planned community from the 1960s, built all at once and abandoned all at once, frozen in time like a Cold War-era time capsule. The town is located in the Bridge River Valley, about 40 kilometers from the nearest maintained road, accessible only by logging roads that require a four-wheel drive vehicle and considerable patience with rough conditions. I made the drive on a warm afternoon in late August, following directions I'd pieced together from old mining reports and recent hiking blogs. The final approach offered glimpses of the town through the trees, geometric shapes that were too regular to be natural, the angular lines of mid-century institutional architecture emerging from the forest. Bradian appeared suddenly as I rounded a final curve, a collection of maybe 30 buildings arranged in neat rows along paved streets that were cracked and potholed but still clearly defined. The town had that distinctive 1960s government issue aesthetic. Flat roofs, simple rectangular designs, large windows, everything built to be functional and economical rather than beautiful. The houses were identical units, repeated with minor variations. The school was a longer version of the same basic design, and the community hall dominated the town center with its larger scale but similar architectural language. I parked at the edge of town and started walking the empty streets, camera in hand, documenting the decay and abandonment. Bradian had been built by Bralorne Mines in the mid-1960s to house workers for their operations in the area, a complete company town constructed in just a couple of years. At its peak, maybe 300 people had lived here, miners and their families, teachers, support staff, all of them employed directly or indirectly by the mining company. Then in 1971, the mine closed, and the company evacuated everyone within weeks, leaving the town empty and slowly returning to the forest. The buildings were remarkably intact despite 50 years of abandonment. The dry interior climate of BC had preserved them better than coastal ghost towns, and the remote location had protected them from extensive vandalism. I could look through windows and see furniture still in place, kitchen appliances still installed, blackboards still on classroom walls. It was as if everyone had simply walked away one day, taking only their personal belongings and leaving everything else behind. I spent the afternoon photographing systematically, documenting each building type, capturing the details of 1960s design and construction. The houses were simple but well built, designed for families with children, each unit with a small yard and space for a vehicle. The school was equipped with what had been modern educational facilities for the time, science labs, a library, a gymnasium. The community hall had a stage for performances, a kitchen for communal meals, meeting rooms for organizations and clubs. Around 4:30 p.m., I was photographing the community hall's interior, documenting the stage and the rows of folding chairs still set up as if awaiting an audience. The light was getting golden, perfect for photography, and I was absorbed in my work, moving through the building room by room. I was in what had been a meeting room, photographing vintage posters still hanging on the walls, when I checked my watch and saw it was 4:45 p.m. That's when I heard the bell. Clear, loud, resonant, the unmistakable sound of a large brass bell being rung with purpose. It wasn't a random clang but a steady rhythm, the kind of deliberate ringing that's meant to carry a message, to call attention, to signal something important. I stopped photographing immediately and listened, trying to locate the source of the sound. The ringing was coming from outside, from somewhere in the center of town. I left the community hall and followed the sound, walking down the empty street toward the town square. The bell continued ringing in that steady, measured rhythm, each stroke clear and powerful, echoing off the abandoned buildings and carrying into the surrounding forest. In the center of the town square, I found the source, a bell tower, a simple wooden structure about 15 feet tall, with an open frame at the top, housing a large brass bell. The bell was swinging, moving through a full arc with each ring, producing that clear, carrying tone. I approached slowly, watching the bell move, trying to understand what I was seeing. There was no one pulling a rope. There was no visible mechanism making the bell swing. There was no wind, the air was still, the trees around the town square motionless. But the bell continued ringing, swinging back and forth with perfect regularity, as if invisible hands were pulling a rope that didn't exist. I walked around the bell tower, examining it from every angle. It was a simple structure, 4 wooden posts supporting a crossbeam from which the bell hung on a metal mounting. There had once been a rope for ringing it. I could see the frayed remnant still attached to the bell's clapper mechanism, but the rope had rotted away decades ago and hung useless, moving slightly with the bell's motion, but clearly not causing it. The bell itself was large, maybe 3 feet in diameter, made of brass that had developed a green patina, but that still rang with perfect tone. It was the kind of bell you'd find in a church or school, designed to be heard across a significant distance, to call people from their homes or workplaces to some central gathering point. I stood there watching for what felt like several minutes, the bell swinging and ringing with that same steady rhythm, making no sense according to any physical principles I understood. There was no mechanism, no power source, no hand pulling the rope, yet the bell rang, as if someone were actively ringing it with purpose and intention. I checked my watch, 4:52 p.m. I timed the ringing, counting the strokes, trying to find any pattern or variation. The bell rang in a steady rhythm, maybe 1 stroke every 3 seconds, each swing producing that clear, carrying tone. And then, at exactly 5 p.m. according to my watch, the bell stopped. Not gradually slowing like a bell that had been set swinging and was running out of momentum, but stopping suddenly, the clapper falling silent mid-swing, the bell settling to stillness, as if someone had caught it and held it still. The silence after the bell stopped was profound. I stood in the empty town square, surrounded by abandoned buildings, trying to process what I'd witnessed. The bell had rung for exactly 15 minutes, from 4:45 to 5 p.m., and then had stopped precisely on the hour. That kind of timing suggested intention, purpose, a schedule being followed. I spent the next hour researching Bradian's history on my phone, using the spotty cell signal I could get at the edge of town. I found old newspaper articles about the mine and the company town, descriptions of daily life in Bradian during its brief operational period. And I found references to the bell. It had been a central part of the community's rhythm, rung at various times throughout the day to mark the mining shifts. The 5 p.m. bell had been particularly significant. It signaled the end of the day shift, calling workers home from the mine, telling families that their fathers and husbands were finished for the day and would soon be walking through the door. It was a sound that meant the workday was over, that families could gather for dinner, that the evening could begin. For the few years that Bradian was operational, that 5 p.m. bell had rung every day, a reliable marker of time in a community where most people's lives revolved around the mine schedule. I stayed in Bradian that night, camping in one of the abandoned houses, planning to see if the bell rang again. I set up my sleeping bag in what had been a living room, using my camping stove to heat dinner, listening to the absolute silence of an abandoned town after dark. No traffic sounds, no voices, no signs of human presence except my own. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional call of an owl hunting in the forest around the town. I woke early the next morning and spent the day exploring more of the town, photographing the mine site itself, documenting the equipment and infrastructure that had been left behind. Around 4:30 p.m., I positioned myself in the town square with my camera on a tripod, pointed at the bell tower, ready to document whatever happened at 4:45. At exactly 4:45 p.m., the bell began ringing again. Same rhythm, same clear tone, same impossible motion with no visible cause. I filmed it, photographed it from multiple angles, even climbed partway up the bell tower to examine the mounting more closely while it rang. There was no mechanism, no hidden motor, no clever system that could make this bell ring. It simply rang, swinging and striking, as if someone invisible were pulling a rope, marking the end of the shift in a mine that had been closed for 50 years. I watched until 5 p.m., when the bell stopped exactly on the hour, settling to stillness with that same abrupt finality. I stayed in Bradian for 3 more days, witnessing the bell ring at 4:45 p.m. every single afternoon, always for exactly 15 minutes, always stopping precisely at 5. On my last day, I talked to an old man I met in the nearest town with year-round residents, a former Bralorn mines worker who'd lived in Bradian in the late 1960s. I asked him about the bell, whether he remembered it from when the town was operational. "Of course," he said. "That bell ran our lives. It rang in the morning to wake us up, rang at shift changes, rang at the end of the day. The 5 p.m. bell was the most important one, meant you could go home, see your family, rest before the next shift. We all lived by that bell." I asked him if he knew that it still rang, that it had continued ringing every day since the town was abandoned. His expression changed, becoming guarded and uncomfortable. "I've heard that," he said quietly. "People who go to Bradian sometimes mention hearing a bell. Most folks think they're imagining it, or that it's just wind or something moving in the tower. But some of us who live there, we know better. That bell rang every day for years, became part of the rhythm of the place. Maybe it's still ringing because that rhythm never really stopped, because somewhere in that town, time is still following the same schedule it always did." I asked him what he meant by that, but he wouldn't elaborate. He just shook his head and said, "Some places don't let go of their routines. Bradian was built all at once and abandoned all at once. Maybe it's stuck in the time when it was alive, still following the same schedule, still ringing the same bells even though no one's there to hear them." I've researched Bradian extensively since my visit, looking for any mechanical explanation for the bells ringing. I've consulted with engineers, shown them my videos and photographs, asked if there's any natural phenomenon that could cause this. No one has an explanation that makes sense. Bells don't ring themselves. They don't swing without being pulled. They don't maintain perfect timing for 50 years without any mechanism or maintenance. But the bell in Bradian's town square rings every day at 4:45 p.m. and stops at 5 p.m., marking the end of a shift in a mine that hasn't operated since 1971, calling workers home to families that evacuated decades ago, maintaining a schedule in a town where time should have stopped, but somehow continues to flow according to the rhythm established in those few years when Bradian was alive. I think about that bell constantly, about what it means that this ritual continues in an empty town. I think about the workers who lived by that bell, who organized their lives around its schedule, who heard it every day for years until the mine closed and they had to leave. I think about how strong a habit can become, how deeply a routine can embed itself in a place, until the place itself continues the routine even after the people are gone. The bell is still there, still ringing every afternoon at 4:45, still marking the end of the day shift, still calling workers home. And I think it will keep ringing until the tower finally collapses, until the bell falls silent not through any choice but through physical decay. Until then, it maintains its vigil, keeping time in a town where time has stopped, following a schedule that no one needs anymore, but that the town itself refuses to abandon. If you ever visit Bradian, arrive before 4:45 p.m. and wait in the town square. Listen for the bell. It will ring exactly on time, as it has every day for 50 years, as it will continue to do for as long as the tower stands and the bell remains capable of swinging. And when you hear it, remember that you're hearing the ghost of a routine, the echo of a time when this empty town was full of people who lived by that bell's schedule, who heard it every day and knew exactly what it meant. Time to go home. The shift is over, the day's work is done. Except the work is never done in Bradian. The bell keeps ringing, the shifts keep changing, the schedule keeps running in a town that exists in 2 states at once, abandoned in our present, but still operational in some echo of its past, that refuses to fully end, that maintains its routines and rituals and daily bells, even though no one lives there to hear them, even though the mine is closed and the workers are gone, and the town is slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The bell rings in Bradian every day at 4:45 p.m., and it will ring tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until the tower collapses, or the bell cracks, or the world ends, keeping time in a place where time should have stopped, calling workers who never really left, maintaining a schedule that has become eternal. Phoenix was a copper mining boomtown near Greenwood that was abandoned in 1919, and the only structure that remains is the cemetery, which produces fog that doesn't dissipate and that shows you the dead walking among the graves. And I think they don't know they're dead. I'm a genealogist and cemetery documenter, traveling throughout British Columbia, photographing abandoned graveyards and recording names and dates for historical databases before the headstones deteriorate beyond reading. The Boundary region near the US border has dozens of these forgotten cemeteries, remnants of the mining boom that swept through the area in the early 1900s, and then collapsed just as quickly, leaving behind ghost towns and the graves of people who'd hoped to build permanent lives in those temporary communities. Phoenix had been one of the largest of these boom towns, growing to over 4,000 people at its peak, around 1,910, built on copper mining that promised to last for generations. The town had everything: hotels, banks, breweries, a hospital, schools, all the infrastructure of a substantial city. Then the copper prices dropped, the high-grade ore ran out, and by 1919 the town was abandoned. The buildings were dismantled or burned, the lots were cleared, and within a few years, Phoenix had disappeared so completely that only old photographs proved it had ever existed. The cemetery was all that remained, preserved by some quirk of land ownership or legal protection that prevented it from being cleared like everything else. It sat on a hillside overlooking where the town had been, about 200 graves marking the people who'd died during Phoenix's brief existence: miners killed in accidents, children who'd succumbed to disease, women who'd died in childbirth, all of them buried with the expectation that they'd rest in a thriving community that would honor their memory. Instead, they rested in isolation, in a cemetery that served a town that no longer existed. I drove to the Phoenix Cemetery on a warm afternoon in late September, following dirt roads through the Boundary region's rolling hills. The area where Phoenix had stood was now just forest and clearings, with a few interpretive signs marking where major buildings had been located. I parked at the base of the cemetery hill and hiked up the slope, carrying my camera equipment and notebook, prepared to spend several hours documenting the headstones. As I climbed, I noticed fog beginning to form around the cemetery. Not general fog covering the area, but localized fog that seemed to originate from the graveyard itself, rising from the ground among the headstones. The surrounding hillsides were clear, the September afternoon bright and warm, but the cemetery was filling with dense fog that reduced visibility dramatically. I reached the cemetery boundary, marked by an old iron fence that was mostly collapsed but still defined the edges of the burial ground. The fog was thick enough that I could barely see 20 feet ahead, a gray wall that muffled sounds and created an enclosed world within the cemetery's boundaries. I stepped through the gap where the fence gate had been and immediately felt the temperature drop. Outside the cemetery, it had been maybe 20 degrees Celsius, comfortable fall weather. Inside the fog, it was cold, winter cold, my breath visible, the damp chill penetrating my jacket. I started working systematically, beginning at the cemetery's western edge and planning to work my way across in rows, photographing each headstone, recording the names and dates. The stones were weathered but mostly legible, simple markers for miners and their families, occasional more elaborate monuments for people who'd been wealthier or more prominent in the community. I was photographing maybe my 10th headstone, crouched down to get a clear shot of the inscription, when I saw movement in the fog. A figure, walking between the graves maybe 30 feet away, moving slowly through the cemetery. I stood up, assuming it was another cemetery documenter, or perhaps a descendant visiting family graves. I called out a greeting, but the figure didn't respond, just continued walking, moving with a deliberate slowness that suggested they were looking for a specific grave. As I watched, more figures appeared in the fog. They emerged from the gray mist as if the fog itself was creating them, taking solid form and moving with purpose through the graveyard. Within a few minutes, I could see maybe a dozen people, all of them walking among the graves, some standing still as if in mourning, others moving between markers as if visiting multiple burial sites. I moved closer to the nearest figure, intending to introduce myself and explain that I was documenting the cemetery for historical records. As I approached, details became clearer through the fog, and I realized something was very wrong. The figure was a woman, dressed in early 1900s mourning clothes, a long black dress, a veil, the kind of formal mourning attire that had been common a century ago but that no one wore anymore. Her clothing looked authentic, not modern reproductions or costume pieces, but actual period garments complete with the kind of wear and detail that you'd only see in museum collections. I got within 10 feet of her and called out again. She didn't react, didn't turn toward me, showed no awareness of my presence. She was standing before a grave, her posture suggesting deep grief, her hands folded in front of her in a mourning pose. I could hear her crying softly, a sound that was muffled by the fog but clearly audible, expressing a loss that felt immediate and raw. I looked at the grave she was standing before. The headstone was weathered, but the inscription was legible: Margaret Chambers, died 1912, aged 28 years, and below that, two smaller stones marking infant graves, children who died in the same year. The woman was mourning a mother and children who'd been dead for over a century, dressed in mourning clothes from that same era, crying with a grief that felt contemporary rather than historical. I backed away slowly, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. I looked at the other figures moving through the fog, and now that I was looking carefully, I could see they were all dressed in period clothing from the early 1900s. Men in dark suits and hats, women in long dresses, children in clothes that matched the era when Phoenix had been at its peak. They moved through the cemetery with familiarity, visiting graves, standing in mourning, walking paths between the headstones as if this were a living cemetery serving a living community. I pulled out my camera and started photographing them, documenting what I was seeing even though I didn't understand it. The figures appeared clearly in my viewfinder, solid, detailed, unquestionably real in their physical presence. They weren't transparent or ghostly in the traditional sense. They looked like living people, just people from the wrong time period, existing in this cemetery as if it were still 1919 and Phoenix still existed at the base of the hill. I watched them for over an hour, observing their movements, listening to their conversations. They spoke to each other in low voices, their words muffled by the fog but audible enough that I could catch fragments. They spoke in the accents and rhythms of a century ago, using phrases and expressions that sounded antiquated. They discussed people I assumed were Phoenix residents, talked about the town as if it were still operational, referenced the mine and the businesses and the daily life of the community. One conversation I overheard particularly disturbed me. Two men standing near a fresh-looking grave were talking about a mining accident that had killed 3 workers yesterday, discussing the tragedy and the impact on the families. I looked at the grave they were standing beside, dated 1911, over a century old. The dirt settled and overgrown despite appearing fresh in the fog. These men were discussing an accident from 1911 as if it had just happened, mourning deaths that had occurred over 100 years ago, existing in a cemetery that for them was still serving a living town. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, the fog grew thicker. Visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet, and the number of figures in the cemetery increased. I counted at least 40 people moving among the graves, some arriving as if for funerals, others leaving as if they'd completed their morning visits and were returning to town. They walked paths through the cemetery that still existed in the fog, but that had long since been overgrown in the actual graveyard, following routes that Phoenix residents would have used when the cemetery was actively serving the community. Around 5 p.m., I witnessed something that made me understand the true nature of what I was seeing. A funeral procession appeared through the fog, maybe 20 people following a simple coffin being carried by 6 men. They processed to a grave site near the cemetery's center, gathered around as the coffin was lowered into a grave that appeared freshly dug, and stood in mourning as what sounded like a minister delivered a service. I moved closer, documenting everything with my camera, and I could see the grave they were burying someone in. The headstone was already in place. James Miller, died 1919, aged 42 years. This was one of the final burials in Phoenix Cemetery, one of the last people who died before the town was abandoned. And these mourners were conducting his funeral, standing at his grave in 1919, existing in a version of the cemetery where that burial was happening now rather than over a century ago. The funeral concluded, the mourners dispersed, and I watched them walk down paths through the fog toward where Phoenix had stood, disappearing into the mist, as if descending into a town that still existed in whatever temporal layer they occupied. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Some of the mourners who'd attended the funeral were walking to other graves, standing before headstones with their own names on them. I watched a woman move from James Miller's funeral to stand before a grave marked Sarah Miller, died 1,919, aged 40 years, and stand there as if visiting her own burial site, as if she were both the dead and the mourner, existing in the fog as a living person while also lying buried in the ground beneath where she stood. I realized then that these weren't ghosts in any traditional sense. They weren't spirits of the dead visiting from some afterlife. They were the actual people buried in this cemetery, still living in 1919, still attending funerals and mourning deaths, and going about the business of honoring their dead, completely unaware that they themselves were dead, that Phoenix was gone, that over a century had passed since the time they were experiencing. The fog was a window into 1919, or a preserved pocket of that time, a bubble where the final year of Phoenix continued to exist in eternal repetition. The people buried in this cemetery were still living in that year, still experiencing the events that led to their deaths and burials, trapped in a loop or preserved in a state where their deaths hadn't fully registered, where they continued their existence in a time that had been frozen when Phoenix was abandoned. As evening approached and the fog grew even thicker, I decided I needed to leave. The sun was setting, darkness was coming, and I was afraid of what would happen if I stayed in this cemetery after nightfall, if I remained in this fog-filled boundary between times when the division between the living and the dead seemed to dissolve completely. I started walking toward the cemetery's edge, toward where I'd entered, but in the thick fog, I became disoriented. The paths had changed, no longer matching the layout of the actual cemetery but following the routes that existed in the fog's version, the 1919 cemetery with its different organization and active use. I walked for 10 minutes, should have crossed the cemetery boundary several times, but I remained within the fog, surrounded by graves and the figures that moved among them. I pulled out my phone's compass, trying to orient myself by direction rather than landmarks. But the compass spun erratically, unable to find north, the magnetic field disturbed by whatever phenomenon was creating this fog and preserving this pocket of 1,919 inches in abandoned cemetery. I forced myself to remain calm, to think clearly. I picked a direction and walked steadily, ignoring the paths and the figures and the graves, just moving in a straight line until I should reach the cemetery's boundary. After maybe 15 minutes of walking, I finally emerged from the fog, crossing an invisible line where the dense mist ended abruptly, and I was back in the clear September evening, standing just outside the cemetery's iron fence. I turned and looked back. The cemetery was entirely obscured by fog, a dense gray mass that filled the burial ground and rose maybe 20 feet into the air, completely contained within the cemetery's boundaries. Outside that area, the air was clear, the evening light golden and normal, but within the cemetery, the fog remained thick and impenetrable, hiding whatever continued to exist within it. I've been back to Phoenix Cemetery twice since that initial visit. Both times, the fog was present, thick and localized, creating that same enclosed world within the graveyard. Both times, I saw the figures moving among the graves, living their 1,919 existence, mourning deaths that had occurred over a century ago, completely unaware that they themselves were dead and buried in the ground they walked on. I've tried to document this phenomenon more systematically, recording audio, taking extensive photographs, measuring the fog's boundaries and temperature. The figures don't appear in most of my photographs. They're visible in maybe 1 in 10 shots, appearing as faint shapes or shadows, rather than the solid people I see with my eyes. The audio recordings capture voices and conversations, but they're distorted and hard to understand, as if the sound is being filtered through layers of time. I've researched Phoenix's abandonment, looking for any explanation for why the cemetery would preserve this temporal pocket. The town was abandoned quickly in 1919 when the mine closed, the residents evacuating over the course of a few months. The last official residents left in December 1919, and by early 1920, Phoenix was empty. The cemetery had received its final burial in November 1919, James Miller, the man whose funeral I'd witnessed in the fog. I think something about that final burial, that last act of the community before it dissolved, created a seal or a preservation, trapping the cemetery and its dead in that final moment when Phoenix still existed. The fog acts as a barrier or a preservation medium, keeping the year 1919 alive within the cemetery's boundaries, allowing the dead to continue their existence in the time just before Phoenix ended, unaware that the world outside the fog has moved on. The cemetery is still there on the hillside overlooking the empty space where Phoenix used to be. The fog still forms every afternoon, thick and cold, creating that enclosed world where the dead walk among their own graves. And if you enter that fog, you'll see them, the miners and their families, dressed in their 1919 clothes, mourning their 1,919 deaths, living their 1,919 lives in an eternal afternoon that never quite reaches evening, never quite ends, never quite acknowledges that Phoenix is gone and they should be at rest. I don't go into the fog anymore. I've documented enough, seen enough, understood enough to know that the cemetery is a place where the boundaries between life and death, between past and present, between what was and what is, have collapsed into a fog-filled space where all times exist simultaneously and the dead continue their existence unaware that they're dead, unaware that over a century has passed, unaware that they're walking through a cemetery that serves a town that no longer exists, except in the fog that never dissipates, that preserves them in eternal mourning, eternal 1,919, eternal life after death, that they don't recognize as death at all. Wells is a partially restored ghost town near Barkerville that has operating businesses alongside abandoned buildings, and I stayed in the Wells Hotel, which is supposed to be a functioning hotel, but the other guests I saw weren't from this century, and I think some of them have been staying there for 80 years. I'm a photographer documenting British Columbia's historic mining towns, and Wells had always intrigued me because unlike most ghost towns, it's not completely abandoned. The town has about 250 permanent residents, a few operating businesses including a hotel and cafe, and several restored buildings that function as art centers and museums. It exists in a strange state between ghost town and living community, preserving its gold rush heritage while maintaining a small modern population. I booked a room at the Wells Hotel for 4 nights in early October, planning to use it as a base for photographing the surrounding area, Barkerville, the abandoned caribou mining camps, the historic buildings scattered through the forests around Wells. The hotel was built in 1933 during a brief gold rush revival that brought new prospectors and mining companies to the area, a 3-story brick building that had operated continuously as an inn for 90 years despite the town's population declining dramatically from its peak. I arrived on a gray afternoon, the autumn rain that's characteristic of the BC interior falling steadily. The hotel's exterior was well maintained, the brick facade freshly painted, the sign above the entrance reading, Wells Hotel, established 1933, in period-appropriate lettering. The parking lot was nearly empty, just 2 vehicles that looked like they belonged to staff rather than guests. I entered through the front door into a lobby that felt frozen in time. The furnishings were original 1930s pieces. The decorations reflected that era's aesthetic, and even the check-in desk looked like it hadn't been modernized since the hotel was built. A woman in her 60s stood behind the desk, and she smiled as I approached. "Checking in?" she asked, pulling out a registration book, an actual physical ledger rather than a computer, another detail that felt authentically historical. I confirmed my reservation, and she flipped through the book, finding my name. "You'll be in room 7, 2nd floor," she said, handing me an old-fashioned metal key, the kind with a decorative tag attached. "Breakfast is served from 7 to 9 a.m. in the dining room, and please be respectful of the other guests. We're fully booked this week." I looked at her in surprise. Fully booked? I didn't see many cars in the parking lot. She gave me a strange look, as if the question confused her. "Not everyone arrives by car," she said simply, then directed me to the stairs leading to the 2nd floor. I climbed the stairs with my bags, walking down a hallway lined with doors numbered 1 through 8. The hallway was empty, quiet except for the sound of rain on the windows at either end. I found room 7, unlocked the door with the heavy metal key, and stepped into a space that perfectly matched the hotel's 1930s aesthetic iron bed frame, period furniture, vintage wallpaper, everything authentic and well preserved. I unpacked and spent the rest of the afternoon organizing my photography equipment, planning my itinerary for the following days. Around 6 p.m., I went downstairs to the hotel's small restaurant for dinner. The dining room was empty except for me and one older couple sitting in a corner booth. I ate alone, reviewing my maps and notes, then returned to my room around 8 p.m. That's when I started hearing the other guests. Footsteps in the hallway outside my room, The sound of people walking past, doors opening and closing, muffled conversations, all the normal sounds of a hotel with multiple occupied rooms. I opened my door and looked out, expecting to see other guests, curious about who else was staying in this remote hotel during the quiet off-season. The hallway was empty, but I could still hear the sounds, footsteps approaching, a door closing somewhere nearby, voices talking in one of the other rooms. I stepped into the hallway and walked toward the nearest sounds, trying to locate their source. As I moved down the corridor, I saw a door open room 3, and a man stepped out into the hallway. He was dressed in a dark suit and hat, the style unmistakably from the 1930s or 1940s. He was carrying a leather suitcase that looked period authentic, and he was moving with the purposeful stride of someone heading somewhere specific. I stepped aside to let him pass, nodding a greeting as he walked by me. He nodded back, touched the brim of his hat in an old-fashioned gesture of acknowledgement, and continued down the hallway toward the stairs. I watched him descend to the first floor, then heard the front door open and close. I went to the window at the end of the hallway and looked down at the street. The man was walking away from the hotel, moving through the rain without seeming to notice it, heading down Wells's main street toward the town center. Over the next hour, I saw more guests. A woman in a 1940s dress and coat emerged from room 5, carrying a hat box and small suitcase. A couple in their 30s, both dressed in 1930s clothing, came up the stairs and entered room 2, talking to each other about tomorrow's shift at the mine, as if the town's gold mining operations were still active. An older man in a worn work jacket went in and out of room 6 several times, each time carrying different items as if he were organizing his belongings. All of them were dressed in period clothing from the 1930s and 1940s. All of them moved through the hotel as if they belonged there, as if this were a normal hotel stay during the town's gold rush heyday. And all of them were completely solid, completely real in their physical presence. I'd passed within inches of the first man, could have reached out and touched him. I tried talking to the woman with the hat box, asking if she was enjoying her stay. She looked at me strangely, as if she didn't quite see me clearly, and said something in response that I couldn't quite hear, her words muffled as if coming through a barrier. Then she continued past me and down the stairs, leaving me standing in the hallway trying to process what I was experiencing. I went back to my room and tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe Wells held regular historical reenactments, and these were enthusiasts staying in character. Maybe the hotel catered to that kind of tourism, offering immersive 1930s experiences. But that didn't explain the owner's comment about being fully booked when I'd seen no cars in the parking lot, or the way the other guests had seemed not quite aware of me, or the overall strangeness of encountering people in perfect period costume, wandering a remote hotel after dark. I stayed up late that first night, listening to the sounds of the other guests. Doors opening and closing, footsteps in the hallway, muffled conversations, occasional laughter, all the normal sounds of a hotel with multiple occupants. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like a party in one of the rooms, music playing, people talking and laughing, the sounds of a social gathering. I went into the hallway and walked toward the sound, identifying it as coming from room 4. I knocked on the door. The sounds continued, but no one answered. I knocked again, louder, and this time the sound stopped abruptly. I waited, but the door didn't open, and after a minute the sound started again as if my knocking had never happened. I returned to my room and tried to sleep, but the hotel was too active, too noisy with the movements of guests who shouldn't exist. I finally fell asleep around 2 a.m., exhausted, the sounds of the phantom hotel continuing around me. The next morning at breakfast, I was alone in the dining room. The owner served me coffee and asked how I'd slept. I mentioned hearing other guests during the night, the footsteps and conversations indoors. She looked at me with that same strange expression she'd given me at check-in. "You were the only guest last night," she said firmly. "The hotel is empty except for you. Those other rooms you heard sounds from, they're unoccupied. No one stayed in them in weeks." I insisted I'd seen people, men and women in period clothing, coming and going from rooms, walking the hallways. She set down the coffee pot and looked at me seriously. "You're not the first guest to mention seeing other people here," she said quietly. "The hotel has a history. It's been operating since 1933, and some of the guests who stayed here back then, well, they never really left. Not in the way we usually think of leaving." She refused to elaborate further, but her acknowledgement that others had seen what I'd seen convinced me I wasn't imagining things. I spent the second day photographing the area around wells, visiting the abandoned mining sites and historic buildings, but I was distracted, thinking about the hotel and what I'd witnessed the previous night. That evening, I returned to the Wells Hotel with my camera, determined to document the phantom guests. I set up in my room with the door slightly ajar, camera positioned to capture the hallway, ready to photograph whatever I saw. The guests started appearing around 8 p.m., following the same patterns as the previous night. The man in the dark suit emerged from room 3 at almost exactly the same time as before, walking with the same purposeful stride, touching his hat brim as he passed my door. I photographed him, the camera clicking as he moved down the hallway. He showed no reaction to the sound, no awareness that he was being photographed. Over the next 3 hours, I documented dozens of appearances. The woman with the hat box, the couple discussing mind shifts, the old man organizing his belongings, all of them repeating routines that seemed established and habitual. And I started noticing new guests. I hadn't seen the previous night: a young woman in a nurse's uniform, a family with 2 children all dressed in 1930s clothing, a group of men in mining work clothes who came up the stairs together talking about today's yields, as if they'd just finished a shift. The photographs captured them clearly, not as ghostly transparent figures, but as solid people, fully visible and detailed. Looking at the images on my camera's display, I could see the texture of their clothing, the expressions on their faces, the authenticity of every period detail. On my third night, I tried a different approach. Instead of staying in my room, I positioned myself in the hallway, sitting in a chair I'd moved from my room, openly watching as the guests came and went. They moved around me, past me, sometimes within inches of where I sat, but they showed minimal awareness of my presence. A few glanced at me with mild curiosity, the way you might notice another guest in a hotel hallway, but most simply went about their business, as if I weren't there. I tried speaking to them, asking questions, attempting to engage in conversation. A few responded, but their voices were always muffled, their words unclear, as if they were speaking through a barrier or from a distance. None of them seemed to find it strange that I was dressed in modern clothing while they wore styles from 80 years ago. None of them acknowledged that anything was unusual about the situation. Around 10 p.m. on that third night, I witnessed something that helped me understand what was happening. A man I hadn't seen before came up the stairs carrying luggage, approached the check-in desk in the lobby, which I could partially see from my position on the stairs, and appeared to be registering. I couldn't see who was working the desk, couldn't hear the conversation, but I watched him complete what looked like a normal check-in process. Then he came upstairs, walked past me, and entered room 8. I went downstairs and asked the owner, who was reading in a small office behind the check-in desk, if anyone had just checked in. She looked at me confused. "No one's checked in since you arrived 3 days ago," she said. "You're still the only guest." I realized then that the Wells Hotel existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. The building was operating as a hotel in our present, with the owner running it as a small inn for modern travelers. But it was also still operating as it had in the 1930s and 1940s, with guests from that era continuing to check in, stay, and check out in a version of the hotel that overlapped with the current one but existed in a different temporal layer. The guests I was seeing weren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They were actual people staying in the hotel during its peak years, their visits somehow preserved or replayed, their presence continuing in a version of the Wells Hotel that had never stopped operating according to its 1930s and 1940s patterns. On my fourth and final night, I stayed up late watching the hallway, documenting the routines of the temporal guests. I noticed that they followed patterns. The man in the dark suit left at the same time each night. The woman with the hat box appeared at consistent intervals. The mining workers came and went, according to what seemed to be shift schedules. They were living their hotel stays on a loop, or their stays were so thoroughly preserved that they continued to play out night after night, the same arrivals and departures, the same conversations and movements, eternal hotel guests in a building that refused to acknowledge that their era had ended. Around 2 a.m., I saw something that disturbed me more than anything I'd witnessed so far. I saw myself walking down the hallway, dressed in the same clothes I was currently wearing, carrying my camera equipment, moving toward room 7. I watched this duplicate of myself unlock the door and enter the room where I was supposedly sitting. I stood up from my chair and walked to room 7, opened the door with my key, and found my room empty, except for my belongings. But I'd clearly seen myself enter that room moments before. Either I'd witnessed a version of myself from a different time, or the hotel's temporal overlapping was so complete that I was existing in multiple time periods simultaneously, visible to myself across the boundaries. I left the Wells Hotel the next morning, checking out with the owner and asking her one final question. The guests I've been seeing, the people in 1930s clothing, are they still checking in? Are there new people arriving? Or is it always the same ones? She considered the question carefully before answering. I think it's both, she said. Some of them have been here as long as I can remember, appearing every night, following the same routines. But occasionally there are new ones, guests I haven't seen before, checking in and staying for a while, before they disappear. The hotel has its own patterns, its own timeline. It's been operating continuously since 1933, and maybe that continuity means it never fully left any of the eras it's operated in. They all exist here together. I've reviewed the photographs I took during those 4 nights, and they clearly show the temporal guests, people in period clothing, occupying a hotel that exists simultaneously in multiple time periods. I've researched the Wells Hotel's history and found references to many of the guests. I saw names in old registration books, newspaper accounts of people who stayed at the hotel during the Gold Rush revival of the 1930s and 1940s. Some of those guests disappeared during their stays, vanishing from the hotel without checking out, never found despite searches. I think they didn't disappear, they just became permanent residents of the temporal overlap, trapped in hotel stays that never ended, checking in decades ago and continuing to occupy rooms that exist in a version of the Wells Hotel that operates parallel to the current one. The hotel is still there in Wells, still operating as a small inn, still hosting guests from multiple eras who occupy it simultaneously. And if you stay there, if you pay attention to the sounds in the hallways at night, if you look carefully at the people you pass in the corridors, you might see them, the eternal guests of the Wells Hotel, living their 1930s and 1940s, stays in a building that exists in all its eras at once. A hotel where time doesn't flow forward but accumulates, where every guest who ever checked in is still there in some layer of reality, still occupying their rooms, still living their temporary stays that became permanent, that will continue as long as the Wells Hotel stands and maintains its continuous operation across the decades that have somehow collapsed into a single eternal present where all times exist together.